Hey everyone, welcome back to Darkverse. I'm Isaac Nightshade, and tonight I have a chilling story that'll leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about reality. It's about a close friend of mine who thought he was just going to have a quiet, uneventful night. But what happened to him turned into something far darker than he ever imagined. He found himself trapped in a nightmare that bled into his waking life. Everywhere he went, he could feel the presence of something watching him. The figure that haunted him in his dreams began to follow him into the real world, and soon he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The whispers, the cold breath on his neck, and that final horrifying moment when he realized he was trapped in a never-ending nightmare. It's one of those stories that stays with you long after it's over, and trust me, after hearing this, you'll never look at your reflection or your dreams the same way again. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into this terrifying journey together. The first time I noticed it, I thought I was imagining things. It wasn't like a loud sound or an overt presence, nothing overtly alarming. No, it was the absence of something. It was the way the air felt heavier, thicker, as though the atmosphere had shifted slightly, just enough to make it noticeable. At first, I chalked it up to the exhaustion of the day, or perhaps stress. But as the nights went on, I realized something was wrong. I had always been a creature of habit, steady, predictable. Every evening I followed the same routine: eat dinner, scroll mindlessly through my phone, and eventually fall into bed. I never gave much thought to my surroundings as I drifted off to sleep. There was comfort in the simplicity of it all. But on that first night, something felt out of place. A weight pressing down on my chest as I lay there in the dark. It was subtle, but it was there, like an invisible hand, lightly brushing my skin, tugging at the edges of my thoughts. It wasn't anything I could describe in detail, just a slow, encroaching sense of unease. At first I thought it was the weather, the storm clouds that had gathered outside, or the faint hum of a neighbor's air conditioner that flickered on and off. But even those didn't seem to account for the sensation. The house was quiet as usual, the faint ticking of the clock in the living room, the soft rustle of leaves outside the window. But then it came, that small, almost imperceptible feeling that made my skin prickle, the sense of being watched. I lay there still, unsure of what to do. Should I get up? Should I check the windows? But I was tired, exhausted really, and I didn't want to give in to the irrational thoughts racing through my head. You're just imagining it, I told myself. You're tired. You've had a long day. And yet the weight in the air didn't lift. The silence in the room didn't feel quite so peaceful anymore. I closed my eyes tighter, as though squeezing them. Shut could ward off whatever invisible presence had settled in the corners of the room. But the sensation didn't fade. It grew, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. But it grew. Something about it, something in the air, shifted, like the room itself was holding its breath. I wanted to turn on the light, to make sure nothing was out of place, but the simple act of reaching over to the nightstand felt like too much effort. I was too tired. I needed sleep. But sleep didn't come. It was then that I heard the first sound, a soft creak. Not from the floor, no. It was more like a door, slowly, quietly, inching open. It was faint, just enough to make me question if I had really heard it, or if my mind had conjured it up. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, a branch brushing against the window, or perhaps a piece of furniture shifting in the next room. But the creak wasn't just a creak, it was a deliberate sound, calculated, methodical. A door that opened just a crack, the hinges protesting, the motion as if something or someone was slipping inside without a sound. I held my breath, but there was nothing. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, wide-eyed and stiff, straining my ears in the suffocating silence. My heart hammered against my chest, louder now, drowning out the faint background noise of the night. But still nothing. Then I heard it again, a creak, closer this time. I sat up slowly, my body moving on its own accord as if it had been possessed by the instinct to run. Yet I remained frozen, staring into the darkness. My mind tried to reason with me. It's just your imagination. It's just the house settling. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. It had only grown stronger, more pressing, more urgent. I turned my head toward the door. The light from the hallway filtered through the crack in the doorframe, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. I didn't remember leaving the door slightly ajar, but there it was, a sliver of darkness where it had once been shut tight. My breath caught in my throat. The feeling of being watched intensified. I didn't know why I did it. Maybe it was a foolish act of curiosity, or maybe I was just too scared to stay still. But I swung my legs off the bed, one foot slowly touching the cold wooden floor. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight, and I winced, hoping against hope that the sound wouldn't alert whatever was in the room with me. The hallway outside was dark. The only light came from the faint glow of the street lamps filtering through the blinds. The air felt thick, damp even, despite the lack of rain. I felt it in my chest, the stifling weight of the air pressing in, wrapping itself around me like a suffocating blanket. And then, a soft thump. It came from the hallway, just outside my bedroom door. I froze, my blood running cold. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't a creak. It was something heavier, deliberate, like something had been dropped or moved in the dark. The sensation of eyes on me grew even more intense. I felt it down to my bones now, like invisible hands were reaching into me, tugging at my thoughts, pulling my focus toward the door, toward the source of that sound. The house was old. It groaned and creaked in the wind. But this was different. This was wrong. I couldn't stay still anymore. My hand moved instinctively to the doorknob, my fingers cold and clammy. The door felt solid beneath my touch, but as I twisted the knob, the door refused to open. I pushed harder. Nothing. A surge of panic rushed through me. I pressed my shoulder against the door, shoving it with my full weight, but it wouldn't budge. It was like the door was sealed shut by something invisible, something I couldn't see but could certainly feel. The noise came again, this time closer, a shuffle of footsteps. I spun around, heart pounding, scanning the shadows in the corners of the room, looking for movement. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. The cold presence, the sense that something was waiting for me in the darkness, waiting to reach out, to grab hold of me when I least expected it. I backed away from the door, my hands trembling. My breath came in shallow gasps, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts that I couldn't quite grasp. I wasn't alone. I was never alone. Then came the whisper. It was faint at first, like the rustle of dry leaves in the wind, but it grew louder with each passing second until it was right next to my ear, breath hot and cold against my skin. Come closer. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to listen, but I couldn't help it. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, to escape, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the shadows, unable to tear myself from the feeling that something was about to happen, something I couldn't control. The whisper repeated, and this time it was clearer, more insistent. Come closer. Come closer. My chest tightened as if the air around me had thickened, smothered me in its weight. I couldn't breathe. My heart raced. I was about to fall apart. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whisper stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. It pressed in on me from all sides, darker and colder than before. And I knew that whatever was waiting for me, whatever had followed me into my room, wasn't going away. The dream came without warning, a sudden plunge into darkness that stole my breath away. One moment, I was lying in bed, drifting into the gentle haze of sleep, and the next I found myself standing on an empty street, alone, yet strangely not. The air was thick, like it was holding its breath, and the street stretched out before me, long and winding. No cars, no people, just the soft rustling of trees that swayed with an eerie, almost rhythmic motion. The trees seemed to have no leaves, their branches reaching up like skeletal arms against the gray sky. It was a cold, lifeless place, one that felt familiar, like a memory buried deep in the back of my mind, just out of reach. I stood there disoriented, unsure of where I was or how I had arrived. The ground beneath my feet was cracked, the pavement uneven, as though it hadn't been used in years. There was no sound but the rustling of the wind through the bare trees, a whispering that somehow felt like it was coming from all around me. Not just the trees. It was as though the very air was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand it. I wasn't scared, not yet, but there was an undeniable sense of wrongness in the air. It wasn't the type of fear that made you run. It was the kind of fear that made you pause, made you stand still and question your surroundings. I could feel it, creeping at the edges of my thoughts, pulling at me, urging me to pay attention to something I couldn't see. I took a tentative step forward, my shoes scraping against the rough pavement, the sound sharp in the unnatural. Stillness. As I moved, the world around me seemed to warp. The street appeared endless, stretching on and on with no end in sight. The buildings on either side were dilapidated, their windows shattered, their doors hanging ajar as though abandoned long ago. There was a heaviness in the air, a presence that I couldn't quite place, but it was suffocating, pressing in on me. I wanted to move faster, to leave this strange place behind, but my legs felt heavy, as though they were sinking into the ground with every step I took. I tried to run, but my body wouldn't respond, only dragging me forward step by slow step. And then I saw it. At the end of the street, standing in the center of the path, was a figure, a silhouette cloaked in shadow. It was standing perfectly still, its outline barely visible against the dim gray backdrop of the sky. At first I couldn't make out any details, just a vague shape, a figure that seemed to absorb the light around it. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its presence seemed to dominate the space like the street itself had been designed to funnel my attention toward it. For a moment I thought I recognized it. There was something about the figure, something familiar, as if I had seen it before, perhaps in another dream or another time. But no matter how hard I strained to remember, I couldn't place it. It was as though it had always been there, waiting for me, a part of something much larger than I could understand. I stopped walking, my heart beginning to race as I stared at the figure. It hadn't moved. It was just standing there, watching me, though I couldn't see its face. The shadows around it were thick, too thick for me to make out any distinguishing features, but I knew it was looking at me. I could feel it. I could feel the weight of its gaze on me, pressing into my chest, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I wanted to look away. I wanted to turn around and run, to escape the pull of that unnerving presence. But I couldn't. Something held me in place like invisible strings tethering me to the ground. I couldn't move, couldn't blink, couldn't even look away from the dark shape at the end of the road. My mind screamed at me to run, to flee from whatever this was, but my body refused to listen. The silence around me deepened, swallowing everything, even the rustling of the trees. It was as though the world had gone mute, leaving only me and that figure in the middle of the road, locked in an unspoken standoff. My heart pounded harder, my chest tightening with every passing second. The figure stood motionless, but I felt its presence like a weight on my skin, cold and suffocating. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand what it wanted from me, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry, my mouth parched, as if the very act of speaking had been stolen from me. And then, as though it had been waiting for me to make the first move, the figure took a single step forward. It was slow, deliberate, and the movement felt unnatural, like the figure was sliding through the air rather than walking. My breath caught in my throat as it came closer, each step bringing it nearer until I could make out the smallest details. The outline of its hands, its long, spindly fingers, reaching toward me. The faintest trace of something like a face, though it was obscured by the darkness that clung to it like a shroud. It stopped again, just within reach. Its presence was overwhelming now, filling the air with an oppressive force that made it difficult to breathe. The world around me seemed to contract, closing in on us. The street, the trees, the buildings, all of it seemed to fade into the background as the figure loomed larger closer, more real than anything else in this strange, dreamlike world. I could feel it then, a subtle pull, a tug in my chest, like something was drawing me toward it. I wanted to fight it, to step back, to break free of whatever strange force held me there, but my body refused to respond. My feet were frozen, cemented in place, and all I could do was stand there paralyzed, staring at the figure as it came closer. It was right in front of me now, and I could feel its presence like an icy gust of wind sweeping through me. The shadow around it seemed to shift, distorting and warping, as if the very darkness was alive, wrapping itself around me, squeezing the air from my lungs. I tried to take a step back, but my body wouldn't obey. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the figure did something that made my blood run cold. It tilted its head. Not much, just enough for the shadows to part slightly, revealing the faintest glimpse of its face. And that face, I'll never forget it. It was pale, so pale that it seemed to glow against the darkness. But it wasn't just the color that made it haunting. It was the way the face seemed to be stretching, as though it was being pulled taut from all sides, its features twisted and contorted into an expression of something beyond fear, something beyond human. Its eyes, dark, empty holes, stared at me. But there was no recognition, no emotion. Only an unsettling, vacant stare that bored into me like it could see straight through my soul. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But the air around me was thick, suffocating. My throat closed, my vision blurred, and all I could do was stand there, trapped in its gaze, as the world around me faded to black. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the figure was gone. I woke up with a start, gasping for air, my heart racing in my chest. The room was dark, the familiar silence of my bedroom wrapping around me like a blanket. I was drenched in sweat, my skin clammy and cold. But the feeling of being watched, of being trapped in that strange, empty street, it didn't go away. I couldn't shake the image of that figure, the way it moved, the way it looked at me, and that familiar sense of dread clung to me long after I opened my eyes, making it impossible to ignore. The dreams didn't stop. They didn't ease off like I had hoped they would. They only got more intense, more suffocating, each night blending into the next in a haze of gray streets and faceless figures. I tried to tell myself that it was all just a product of my imagination. Too much stress, too little sleep. But deep down, I knew something had changed. Something had latched on to me. Something that wasn't quite bound by the rules of sleep. Every night, without fail, I would find myself back in that same place. The street was always the same, stretching out endlessly before me, flanked by those hollow trees whose branches twisted toward the sky like gnarled hands. The air was thick, oppressive, and I could never quite place where the sky ended and the earth began. The shadows seemed to swallow everything except it. The figure standing at the end of the street, always there, always watching, but never moving. Its silhouette was just a dark shape against the pale, desolate background. I couldn't see its face, but I didn't need to. The absence of its face was the most terrifying part. It wasn't just watching me, it was waiting for me. Every time I woke up, I would feel the aftershocks of its presence, the lingering sensation of being observed, like my every movement was being studied. I couldn't shake it. No matter how many times I forced my eyes shut, how many breaths I took to calm myself, I couldn't escape the feeling that something had followed me back into the real world. It started to bleed into my waking hours. I'd be sitting at my desk working, and then, there, a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow that seemed too long, too stretched, or the faintest creak of a floorboard when I knew I was alone. It never lasted long, but it was enough to make my stomach knot, enough to make my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it. I tried to push it down, to pretend that it was just stress, but the feeling grew. I couldn't shake the unease. I didn't feel safe in my own home anymore. The familiar hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, everything that used to be so comforting now felt distant, alien, as if the walls were closing in on me. But then one night, everything shifted. I had been lying in bed, exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open. The last thing I remember before drifting off was the steady sound of my breath, the warmth of the blankets surrounding me. Sleep came quickly, but not peacefully. I was back on that street again. The trees stretched up toward the heavens, their skeletal branches scratching against the sky. But this time the figure wasn't standing at the end of the road. This time it was closer, much closer. I could feel it now, that strange sense of dread that crawled up my spine, that suffocating pressure that pushed down on my chest. The figure was moving, slowly, deliberately, each step bringing it closer, but I couldn't look away. Legs felt like they were made of stone, unable to move, but I had to move. I had to get away because I could feel it. The eyes. I knew it was staring at me, even though I couldn't see its face. It wasn't even the eyes themselves that terrified me. It was the weight of that gaze, the unspoken understanding that this thing, whatever it was waiting for something. Waiting for me to do something. Waiting for me to make a move. And then just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It stood motionless, a dark shadow against the gray backdrop. I knew I had to wake up, but I couldn't. I tried to open my eyes, but they refused to cooperate, and I couldn't breathe, the air thick and stifling, as if the entire world had gone quiet and still. That's when I felt it, a pressure on my chest, a weight that grew heavier and heavier. Something cold, a presence that I couldn't see but could feel. And then, bang, a loud, sharp noise that jolted me awake. My eyes snapped open. I was in my bed. The familiar, mundane surroundings of my room greeted me. I had returned. Or had I? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different, that something wasn't quite right. The room was cold, colder than it should have been for a spring night. My breath formed a thin mist in front of me, and I shivered, pulling the blanket up tighter around my shoulders. But the cold didn't come from the window, didn't come from the chill of the night air. It came from something else, something I couldn't see. I lay still, listening, trying to calm my erratic heartbeat. The house was quiet, too quiet. I could hear the soft rustling of the trees outside, their branches scraping against the windows. But it was the silence in the house that unsettled me. It was too heavy, too thick. I couldn't hear anything. No ticking of the clock, no creaking of the floorboards, nothing. And then I heard it, a soft knock. At first I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the residue of the dream still, lingering in my thoughts. But then the sound came again. Knock, knock, knock. It was faint but distinct, the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, tapping on my bedroom door. I held my breath, straining to listen. It couldn't be. There was no one here. I was alone. The house was empty. I hadn't heard a car pull into the driveway, no footsteps in the hallway, nothing that would explain the knock. But there it was again, louder this time, more deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight, dry. I couldn't make a sound. My eyes flicked to the door, the shadows in the hallway beyond it, stretching out like fingers, reaching toward me. I could feel the cold creeping in around me, inch by inch, as if something was seeping through the walls, suffocating the air. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, my hands clutching the blanket so tightly my knuckles were white. The knock came again, and this time, it was followed by a soft scraping sound, like nails gently dragging across wood. It was too much. My mind raced, my heart thundering in my chest. I knew I should get up, check the door, but I couldn't make myself move. I was paralyzed by fear, by the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong, that whatever was outside my door wasn't what it seemed. The knock came again, this time followed by a long pause, a beat of silence that stretched out like an eternity, and then, creak, the sound of the door slowly beginning to open. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what was on the other side, but I had to. My body moved on its own, against my will, until my eyes were fixed on the crack between the door and the frame. The dark hallway beyond seemed to stretch out endlessly, like it was sucking in the light from my room. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the door. It was too dark to make out details, but I knew it was there, standing motionless. My heart skipped a beat. I wanted to scream, to get up and run, but my body refused to obey. The figure was there, but not there, like it was a shadow, a presence more than anything else. The door creaked open wider, just a few inches, and the cold air rushed in, freezing the room even more. I could feel it now, the weight of its gaze, the pull of its presence. I wasn't alone. Then the door slammed shut. I shot up in bed, my body drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The room was still cold, the air thick with something I couldn't explain. My breath was shallow and I was gasping, as if I had just run a marathon. But I wasn't running. I was lying in my bed, the shadows of my room the same as they had always been. The same as they had always been, or so I thought. But the feeling remained, that unmistakable sensation of being watched, of something that had followed me back from the dream. I wasn't alone. I knew that now, and whatever it was waiting. The fourth night, everything changed. I had been exhausted, my days blending into one another, each one more monotonous than the last. But somehow the weight of fatigue never fully seemed to ease. I had grown used to the dreams, the strange street, the shadowy figure. Each night, the same dark place, the same still figure waiting at the end of the street. But on the fourth night, it wasn't the street or the figure that startled me. It was the sound. It started softly, barely more than a murmur in the distance. I couldn't even tell if it was part of the dream at first, perhaps some fragment of a memory or a thought bleeding into my slumber. It was almost as though the wind had whispered my name, but it was too clear, too distinct to be dismissed as a trick of the mind. I felt it before I heard it, a shift in the air, a chill running through my spine, as though the room itself had grown colder, sharper. And then, just above the faint rustling of the trees in my dream, I heard it. Come, closer. The voice was soft, like the breeze against your skin, but it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside my head. It was the dream. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding in my chest, the room around me suddenly feeling too quiet, too still. The weight of that voice hung in the air, pulling at the edges of my consciousness. I lay there paralyzed, staring into the darkness of my bedroom, trying to rationalize what had just happened. I could still feel the aftershock of the whisper echoing through me, like a vibration that refused to stop. My eyes flicked around the room, desperate to find something familiar, something that would ground me, but there was nothing. The same silence, the same thick, suffocating air that had become a permanent presence in the house. I lay in the dark, my body stiff, my mind racing, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. Something had changed. I waited. The seconds stretched out into minutes, and yet the stillness of the room only made it worse. I kept expecting the sound to come again, that voice, but it didn't. Nothing moved. Not a whisper, not a creak in the floorboards. The only sound was the soft thrum of my heartbeat in my ears. Still, I couldn't bring myself to close my eyes again. My mind kept telling me that if I fell back to sleep, I might hear it again. I might hear the voice calling me. It was too real, too alive. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I closed my eyes, but sleep did not come easily. I tossed and turned, my thoughts tangled with dread. It felt as though the darkness around me had thickened, as if the night had become something more alive, more aware of my presence. I was sure of it now. Whatever had been in my dreams had crossed over. The barrier between the real and the unreal had thinned. I woke again just before dawn, a cold sweat clinging to my skin. My breath was shallow, ragged. The room was still too cold, too oppressive. The whisper that had called my name still lingered in my ears, and though I knew I had to shake it off, a part of me was reluctant. It felt as though I was being pulled towards something I couldn't resist. The next night, I thought I was prepared for it. I was wrong. I had barely closed my eyes when it came again. This time louder, clearer, more insistent. Come closer. I felt it like a physical force, like a hand reaching out from the dream, brushing against my skin. The coldness that flooded the room this time was even worse. It was unnatural, almost biting. The air seemed to thicken, the walls pressing in, narrowing the space around me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just the sound of the whisper, it was the way it felt. It was like it was right there, in the room with me, inches from my ear. I gasped for breath, struggling to push the covers off, to move, to do anything, but my limbs were heavy, like they were weighed down by invisible chains. I tried to call out, but my voice was lost in the silence, swallowed up by the darkness that had settled so heavily around me. I wanted to run, to escape, but I was frozen, unable to break free from the pull of the whisper. The voice had no shape, no face, but it was everywhere, inside me, outside me, echoing through the room like a presence that had always been there. I could feel it crawling beneath my skin. Come closer, it repeated, this time with a sense of urgency, a demand. I tried to focus on something, anything, to ground myself, but there was nothing. The room had become something else entirely, a place where I no longer felt safe. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in, the shadows creeping closer, watching, waiting. The air grew colder still, and the whisper grew louder, now almost mocking, as if it knew I was listening, as if it knew I was powerless to resist. My body trembled with the effort to move, to do something, anything to escape, and then it stopped. The room went deathly quiet. No voice, no whisper, no sound at all. The stillness was more suffocating than the cold had been. I didn't dare open my eyes, afraid that the silence was only a trick, a pause before something worse would come. I lay there wide-eyed, waiting for something, anything to happen, but the minutes dragged by and nothing came. My mind raced, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Was it gone? Was it finally over? Or was it waiting, lurking just beyond my reach, biding its time until I thought I was safe? I couldn't take it anymore. I had to look. Slowly, almost against my will, I forced myself to open my eyes. The dim light of the moon filtered through the blinds, casting long, thin shadows across the room. Everything looked the same furniture, the same faint outline of the window where the moonlight crept in. But it wasn't the room I was looking at. It was the shadows. They were moving ever so slightly, twisting in unnatural ways, bending and stretching as though they were alive, following some rhythm. I couldn't understand. They seemed to be shifting closer, inch by inch, and that's when I heard it again, though this time it wasn't the whisper. This time it was worse. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, too heavy to be a mouse, too soft to be a person. The footsteps echoed through the silence, each step like a thud in my chest. They were coming from outside my room, just beyond the door, just beyond the edge of the hallway. My heart stopped. The blood drained from my face. I waited, terrified to move, afraid to breathe. The footsteps were getting closer, each one resounding louder in my head than in the hallway itself. I could almost feel them, the pressure of someone walking toward me, but I couldn't see them. I couldn't see anything. It was the sound of someone walking directly toward my door. The air in the room turned cold again, freezing as if the very temperature had been sucked from the space. My eyes darted to the door, and I held my breath, waiting for the inevitable. The door creaked. It wasn't a loud noise. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. Enough to send a wave of panic crashing through me. The door was opening. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed with fear, my mind screaming for me to do something, anything, but I couldn't. The door inched open, the shadows from the hallway creeping in like dark fingers. I could see nothing but blackness beyond it, nothing but that suffocating emptiness, the same blackness that had filled my dreams. The footsteps stopped. There was no sound, only silence, oppressive and thick. And then, whisper, There it was again. That voice, no longer distant, but right behind me, right in my ear. Come closer. The breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I felt its presence, standing there, just beyond the door, waiting, watching, and then I heard a low laugh. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a burst of sound. It was a soft, almost soothing sound like the distant hum of an old song. But it wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. It was a laugh that didn't belong. And that's when I realized the voice, it wasn't asking me to come closer. It was inviting me. I didn't notice it at first, at least not consciously. It was just a flicker at the edge of my vision, a shadow that seemed to move with the corner of my eye, almost like it was teasing me, daring me to look directly at it. But I didn't. I told myself it was nothing. The kind of thing that happens when you've been working too long or staring at a screen for hours. Nothing more than a trick of the light, a passing shift in the way the shadows fell. But over time, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The dark shape, always in the same place, always there, just beyond my line of sight. It wasn't big, nothing as noticeable as a figure standing fully in front of me. No, it was smaller than that, like something trying to stay out of view, creeping just within the boundaries of my perception. Every time I glanced toward it, it disappeared, as though it were nothing but a figment of my tired eyes. But as the days went on, it started to feel real. It wasn't just in my peripheral vision anymore. It was more than that. It was becoming an almost tangible presence, like a whisper that turned into a low murmur, a constant reminder that something wasn't quite right. I told myself it was my imagination, stress, exhaustion, too much on my mind. My job had been overwhelming lately. My sleep patterns had become irregular, and there were plenty of reasons to explain away what I was seeing, or thought I was seeing, but deep down, I knew better. The more I tried to brush it off, the more I could feel the unease crawling under my skin. It wasn't until the third day that I noticed the shift. I had been sitting at my desk, my back to the room, mindlessly typing away, trying to get through another long night. The shadows of the evening stretched across the walls, wrapping the room in a dim, oppressive silence. The light from my desk lamp flickered, casting brief, sharp shadows that danced along the walls. But something was different this time. Something felt heavier, colder. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the room seemed to close in on me. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glimpse the corner of the room where the shadow always lingered. It was still there, but now it was closer, a dark, shifting mass near the door. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was there, standing motionless, but watching, waiting. And for the first time, I felt the instinct to not look. I turned away quickly, trying to concentrate on my work, but the weight of that thing in the corner of my room, just out of sight, became impossible to ignore. My thoughts raced. Was it really there? Or was it just a symptom of my growing paranoia? Either way, the chill I felt in my spine was undeniable. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I tried to push it from my mind. I had work to do, errands to run, people to see, but the shadow followed me, lingering in my thoughts like a dark cloud that hovered just above me. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I half expected it to be closer, waiting for me. Like it was following my every move. I laughed at myself. It was ridiculous. There was nothing there. It was just a trick of the light, a misperception, an overactive mind. But then the third night came, and everything changed. I had just finished a late dinner and was heading back to my bedroom. The house was silent, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the night outside. The air in the hallway felt unusually cold as I walked toward my door. As I reached for the doorknob, I stopped. There was something in the corner of the room. I stood frozen, my breath hitching in my throat. The figure that had been haunting the periphery of my vision for days, the shadow that never quite revealed itself, was now there, fully formed, standing in the doorway. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, heart thundering in my chest. The figure was obscured by darkness, its features hidden by the shadows that clung to it like a cloak. I couldn't make out its shape, but I could feel it. The presence of it, cold and oppressive, washed over me like a wave of dread, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I blinked, but the figure didn't go away. It stood there motionless, waiting, watching. It was as though it knew I could see it now, that it had been waiting for me to notice it. I should have run. I should have screamed. But I didn't. I was rooted to the spot, the fear too heavy to move, too thick to shake. The figure didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, and the longer I looked at it, the more I felt myself being drawn to it. Like a moth to a flame, I felt an almost magnetic pull, something deep, inside me urging me to step closer, to find out what it wanted. I told myself I was crazy. I knew it wasn't real, that it couldn't be, but I couldn't look away. The shadows shifted around it, thickening, as if the darkness itself were bending to its will. A cold gust of air rushed through the room, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something shift in the darkness. Something long and twisting, like a tendril reaching out toward me. My breath caught in my throat. I forced myself to move, my legs shaking beneath me. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorframe, ready to bolt, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure in the doorway. It was so dark, too dark to make out any real detail, but I could feel it, like the weight of 1,000 eyes, all of them focused on me. I could feel the chill of its presence, the coldness that seeped into my skin and crawled into my bones. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the figure shifted. It was subtle at first, a slight movement, a twitch in the darkness, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. It knew I was watching. It knew I was there. I backed away, but it was too late. My vision swam as I stumbled toward the bed. My heart pounded against my chest, and the walls seemed to close in on me, the room shrinking with every breath. The air was so cold, and the shadow in the doorway felt like it was expanding, its presence reaching out, pushing me further into the corner of the room. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. I stood there, frozen, my chest rising and falling in rapid gasps. The room was still, eerily still. No creaking floorboards, no rustling of the wind. Nothing. The door was wide open, but the shadow, the figure, had disappeared. I wasn't sure if I was relieved or more terrified than before. I didn't dare approach the door, not wanting to risk seeing it again. But I couldn't deny what I'd seen. It had been real. It had been there. And I knew deep down that it wasn't done with me yet. It was waiting for me, watching me, biding its time. I stayed awake the rest of the night, the sound of my breath the only thing breaking the suffocating silence. Every little noise sent my heart into my throat. Each creak of the house, each rustle of the trees outside. I knew it wouldn't be long before it returned. That shadow, that thing in the corner, wasn't finished with me. It never had been. I didn't know how much longer I could keep running. How much longer I could keep pretending that the shadows weren't real, that they couldn't see me. But somehow, deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before it came for me again. And this time, I wouldn't be able to escape. The dreams started to change around the second week, but I didn't notice at first. The streets were still the same, long, empty, and gray. But now there was something different, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The figure that always stood at the end of the road had begun to move. Slowly at first, just a subtle shift, like the figure was testing its own power. But as the days passed, the figure became more active, more deliberate in its movements. It didn't walk like a person, no. It slid. It was as though it floated, gliding across the cracked pavement, never lifting its feet, but always drawing closer. The same eerie silence enveloped everything. There was no wind, no sound of nature or life, just the rhythmic thumping of my own heartbeat as I watched the figure inch toward me. Every time I tried to move, my legs felt like they were made of stone. I couldn't run. I couldn't escape. All I could do was watch. The figure never spoke, but sometimes I thought I heard whispers. Quiet at first, like the wind through the trees, but they grew more distinct, more insistent with each passing night. I could never quite make out the words. The sounds never seemed to form anything coherent, just fragments, half sentences that left my mind straining for meaning. A word here, a name there, something just beyond my reach, teasing me. There was no comfort in it, only a growing sense of dread, a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, as though the whispers were calling me, beckoning me closer. At first I thought it was just my mind, overactive from stress or exhaustion. But as the dreams grew more vivid, more oppressive, I realized that it wasn't just my imagination. The dreams were changing, but it wasn't just the figure that was shifting. The entire landscape was becoming more real, more tangible, until it was like I could actually feel the pavement beneath my feet, smell the dampness of the trees, and sense the weight of the silence pressing in on me. One night, the figure moved faster, its gliding pace quickening, and that's when I felt it. The first time it was truly close to me. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. My breath caught in my chest as it reached out toward me. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that I was projecting my fear onto the figure. But no, the air felt colder. The whispers turned into something more. A voice that echoed in my ears, low and guttural. I couldn't make out the words, but the urgency in the sound was undeniable. The figure's shadow stretched long, and the darkness surrounding it seemed to pulse, like it was alive, breathing. Then it reached out again, its arm extending toward me in a slow, deliberate motion. I tried to move, tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. My feet felt as though they were nailed to the ground, and all I could do was stare at its hand, getting closer. Its fingers stretched long, impossibly so, the skin on them pale and stretched tight. And there, at the end of its hand, I could see it. A finger pointed at me. It was reaching for me. I could almost feel the cold air it moved through, the chilling touch of its proximity. My mind screamed at me to wake up, but it was like I couldn't. My eyelids were heavy, locked shut in that terrifying, dreamlike paralysis. I couldn't breathe. The figure's hand was close, so close that I felt the coldness in the air, like it was freezing everything around me. The world seemed to blur, and I could hear the low hum of the whispers again, louder now, but still unintelligible. The tension built inside me, my body rigid, my heart hammering in my chest. I could feel its fingers, soft but cold, brushing against my skin. The sensation was too real, too vivid. It was like something physical was happening, like it wasn't just a dream anymore. Suddenly, I woke with a gasp, my body jerking upright in bed. My skin was cold and clammy, and my breath came in short, sharp bursts. My chest felt tight, as if I had just run a marathon, and I was drenched in sweat. I blinked into the darkness of my room, disoriented, trying to shake off the remnants of the dream. The silence around me was too thick, too oppressive, and I could feel my pulse racing in my neck, the blood pounding in my ears. I reached up to wipe the sweat from my forehead, but my fingers brushed against something cold. The sensation was sharp, like ice against my skin. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The lingering feeling of the dream, the coldness, the pressure, the sensation of fingers against my skin, was still there, as though it had followed me back from that strange, empty street. I pulled my hand away from my forehead, but the feeling didn't fade. I glanced down at my arm. The skin was goosebumps, slick, with cold sweat. My whole body was trembling, and I couldn't shake the image of the figure, the feeling of its fingers on me, pressing into my skin like it had left some sort of mark. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. The darkness felt suffocating, thicker than usual, but the room was still, empty. I tried to tell myself it was just the lingering effects of the dream, but my mind couldn't shake the image of that hand, the sensation of it on me. It was so real, too real. I couldn't go back to sleep. I sat up in bed for hours, eyes wide open, listening to the eerie silence of the night, waiting for something to change, for the figure to return, for the dream to start again. But it didn't. The rest of the night passed in an uncomfortable stillness, with only the sound of my own ragged breathing filling the space. The next few nights were no better. The dreams didn't stop. They didn't even slow down. Each night the figure grew closer, more deliberate in its movements. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. I couldn't make out the words, but there was no mistaking the tone. It was a voice that demanded attention, that forced my focus. The figure didn't just stand still anymore. It moved. Sometimes it would glide toward me, slow but inexorable. Other times it would linger at the end of the street, watching, waiting for me to take a step forward. Each time it would reach out, and each time it was closer. I could feel the chill in the air, the fingers stretching out toward me, growing longer, more unnaturally thin, like they were reaching from a place beyond the edges of reality. I could feel them getting closer. I could feel their cold touch on my skin, that same bone-chilling sensation that seemed to seep into my body, stealing my breath away, leaving my chest tight and frozen. The whispers would grow louder, like they were about to say something important, something I needed to hear, but they were always just beyond comprehension, always just out of reach. I could feel myself starting to unravel. The line between waking and sleeping began to blur, and I couldn't tell where the dreams ended and reality began. The figure was there in the corner of my vision during the day now. Not just in the dream world. It would appear in the shadows of my room, in the hallway, at the edge of the trees outside my window. Always there, always watching, moving closer with every glance. One night I woke up with the sense that something was different. Something had changed. I sat up in bed, my body drenched in sweat, and immediately the weight of the room felt wrong. The darkness was too thick, like it was pressing in on me. I could feel the air change, like something was waiting, just beyond the reach of the light. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to turn toward the door, but I did. And there, standing at the threshold of the room, was the figure. Its shape was hard to make out. Just a shadow, a silhouette, darker than the room around it, but I could feel its presence. I could feel its eyes on me. Even though it had no face, it was the same figure from the dreams, but it was here now, in my room, watching me. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough. The coldness that filled the room, the suffocating pressure, was enough. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was as if the world had stopped, frozen in place by the weight of its gaze. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, vanished into the darkness, leaving only the cold, the silence, and the lingering touch of its fingers on my skin. The figure had crossed into my world, and I knew with a sickening certainty that it was only the beginning. It started subtly at first. Little things, tiny, almost imperceptible anomalies that I tried to brush off as my imagination playing tricks on me. But as the days wore on, the feeling of something wrong, something watching me, grew harder to ignore. It wasn't just the strange figure that had haunted my dreams anymore. It was here, in my waking life. It followed me into the real world, and I could feel it watching me. It began with the mirrors. At first, it was just a shadow flickering at the edges of my reflection. I'd catch glimpses of it in the bathroom mirror as I brushed my teeth or adjusted my hair. Something dark, always just behind me, but never clear enough to make out. It wasn't like an actual figure. No face, no body, no details. Just a vague, dark shape, an impression of something watching me from the periphery. And every time I would turn to look, it was gone. The mirrors would reflect nothing but me, perfectly ordinary. I told myself it was nothing. A trick of the light, maybe. A smear on the glass. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But as the days passed, I started to notice it more frequently. The shadows grew more pronounced, more defined. The shape began to become clearer, a dark outline, always there when I wasn't looking. Directly. The feeling of being watched intensified. It was like there was something or someone just behind me. Every time I glanced at the mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the reflection of the room I was seeing in the glass, but something else, something off. And when I caught myself staring too long into the mirror, it was as if the air in the room thickened, the world outside the reflection fading into something distant, unreal. The room felt colder somehow, the edges of everything around me growing more distant, as if the mirror were pulling me in. It happened again one morning. I had just woken up, the usual grogginess clouding my thoughts. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing my hair, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. The morning light filtered through the window, casting a soft glow on the bathroom tiles, but there was something unsettling about it. Something about the way the light seemed to bend unnaturally against the reflective surface. It was almost as if the mirror itself was too bright, too clear. As I stared at my reflection, running the brush through my tangled hair, I saw it again, the shadow. It wasn't a trick of the light this time. It wasn't some small flicker at the corner of my vision. It was right there, just behind me, a dark shape, tall, almost like a figure, but with no distinct features, no form, just a presence I could feel pressing in around me, just over my shoulder. My heart skipped a beat, a sense of panic rising in my chest. I turned quickly, my gaze snapping to the spot in the room where the shadow had been, but the space was empty. The bathroom was silent, save for the sound of the brush through my hair and my own shaky breaths. But the feeling lingered, like something was still there, just beyond the corner of my vision. I turned back to the mirror, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I wasn't going to give in to this. It wasn't real. But the moment I looked at myself again, my breath caught in my throat. My reflection didn't blink. I froze, the brush in my hand pausing mid-motion. My reflection, still and unmoving, stared back at me with wide, unblinking eyes. I blinked once, then twice, feeling a cold sweat break out across my skin. But the reflection didn't change. It stayed frozen, the same eerie stillness in the glass. It was as if I had been separated from myself, like the reflection was no longer connected to me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, the rapid beat in my ears drowning out everything else. The reflection, the version of me standing there, wasn't reacting at all. Its eyes were wide open, fixed, unblinking, and completely lifeless. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. I felt an overwhelming urge to turn away, to break the connection, to escape the frozen stare of the mirror. But I couldn't. It was like my body was rooted to the spot, my gaze locked on the reflection, unable to look away. I didn't understand what was happening. What was happening? Then just as suddenly as it had happened, I snapped back into control of myself. I jerked away from the mirror, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The reflection, my reflection, blinking again, moving normally as though nothing had happened. But I wasn't fooled. I could still feel it. The dread that crawled along my spine, the cold weight of something pressing in on me. The sensation that it hadn't just been the mirror that had been altered, but something far more insidious, something that had crossed over with me from that place I had been visiting in my dreams. I backed away from the mirror slowly, unable to shake the feeling that something had been waiting for me there, that it was still there, just beyond the surface of the glass, biding its time. I didn't dare look back at it. Instead, I quickly left the bathroom, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The feeling didn't go away. It followed me through the rest of the day. That weight, that presence lingering, just out of sight. I couldn't stop thinking about the mirror, about the reflection. I had to know. I had to prove it wasn't real. But I couldn't bring myself to look again. Not yet. That night I tried to sleep, but the shadows in my room felt heavier than usual. I kept thinking I saw things moving in the corner of my vision. Shapes that weren't there when I looked directly at them. And all I could think about was the mirror, the reflection that hadn't blinked, that stillness in the glass. I tossed and turned, my mind racing, until finally the exhaustion won, and I fell into a restless sleep. The dreams came again, but this time they were different. The streets were darker, the figure more vivid. It wasn't just standing at the end of the road anymore. It was right beside me, always lurking just outside my reach, its presence suffocating. I could feel it watching me, could feel its breath, like cold air on the back of my neck. the whispers coming clearer now. And though I couldn't understand the words, they felt more familiar, more personal. But the most unsettling part wasn't the figure. It wasn't the whispers. It was the feeling of being trapped, of being pulled towards something, something just beyond the edge of the dream. I knew in that dream that it was no longer just a dream. The boundaries were blurring. The figure was real, and it was waiting for me. I woke in the middle of the night, my body drenched in cold sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. I gasped for breath, my mind trying to piece together what had just happened. The room was dark, silent, and I tried to convince myself that it was just the remnants of the dream, nothing more. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when I heard it, the whisper, low, hushed, but unmistakable. "Look!" I froze. My entire body stiffened. I didn't want to. Look! I knew what I would find if I did. But the voice, it was as though it came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The air grew cold, and the silence stretched out, suffocating me. I could feel something shifting in the room, something waiting for me to turn, to face it. With a trembling hand, I reached for the light switch. My breath caught in my throat as I prepared to face whatever was in the room with me. I turned it on. The room was empty. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. But when I glanced at the bathroom mirror, my heart stopped. There, standing in the reflection, was the figure. Not in the corner this time. It was right behind me. Its eyes were wide open, staring, unblinking, just like my reflection had been that morning. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure faded back into the glass. I stood there, frozen in place, staring at the empty reflection of the bathroom, the echoes of the whisper still ringing in my ears. The room around me felt too quiet, the air too thick, too still. Something was wrong. I could feel it. And whatever it wasn't done with me yet. It started with the door. At first, I didn't think much of it. I had always been a person who liked the comfort of a locked door at night. It wasn't that I was paranoid, or so I thought, but there was something about the feeling of being alone, the kind of solitude where the outside world couldn't reach, that put my mind at ease. So I'd lock my bedroom door every night without fail. Just a simple thing, a small habit, but one that made me feel secure. But one night, everything changed. I woke up in the middle of the night, the oppressive silence of the house settling over me like a heavy weight. I hadn't been asleep long enough for it to be morning, just a few hours of restless tossing and turning. I hadn't expected to wake up at all, but the feeling of being watched stirred me from my dreams. I opened my eyes, trying to adjust to the darkness. The room was still. The only sound was the faint hum of the house settling around me. Everything seemed normal, but there was one thing that caught my attention: the door. I hadn't left it open. I knew I hadn't. I remembered the usual routine, checking the locks, pulling the door shut, hearing that satisfying click as it latched into place. But now the door was wide open, not just slightly ajar, but wide open. My heart skipped a beat. I lay frozen, staring at the dark doorway, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. Had I forgotten to close it? But no, I had locked it, hadn't I? There was no way I could have forgotten that, not with the habit I had built over the years. The room felt colder now, and I shivered under the covers. An icy chill crawled down my spine as I glanced back toward the door, my pulse quickening. My eyes strained against the darkness, trying to make sense of the faint outline of the hallway beyond. But there was nothing. The hallway was empty. Still, something didn't feel right. The silence in the room thickened, becoming suffocating, like the air had become heavier, pressing down on me. I didn't know what it was, but I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. The door was open, yes, but it was more than that. It was as if something, or someone, had been in here. I tried to shake off the creeping unease crawling through me. I had to be imagining things. It was just the night playing tricks on my tired mind. But still, I couldn't tear my eyes away from the doorway. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt the weight of the darkness beyond it, pressing in from the hallway, waiting. Then I heard it. Soft footsteps. At first I thought I was imagining it. The sound was so faint, so quiet, that I convinced myself it was just the house settling. Maybe the wind outside or the old floorboards creaking under their weight. But as I listened closer, the footsteps became clearer. Too clear, like they were in the hallway just beyond the door. Slow, deliberate steps, each one purposeful. The sound echoed in my mind, filling the room, louder and louder. Someone was out there. The realization hit me like a cold wave crashing over my chest. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart began to pound, the rhythm of it thrumming in my ears. I held my breath, trying to listen, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the footsteps didn't stop. The steps were growing nearer, slow, steady, moving with a precision that felt deliberate, almost calculated. My body tensed as I listened, my eyes locked on the open door. I could feel the air in the room grow colder with each passing second, a deep chill that wasn't from the outside, but from inside, as if the darkness itself was seeping into the room, curling around me like a suffocating blanket. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. Every muscle in my body was frozen, locked in place by a primal instinct to remain as still as possible. I didn't want to make a sound. I didn't want to alert whatever it was. In the hallway that I was awake, that I had heard it, but the footsteps continued, each one slower than the last, dragging out the seconds as if they were stretching time itself. I couldn't see anything. The hallway was dark, the shadows beyond the door so thick that I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel it. The presence, like someone or something, was just beyond the threshold, waiting, watching. The footsteps stopped. A sudden, oppressive silence filled the space between us. I could hear my own breathing now, shallow and fast. But that was it, nothing else. I strained my ears, waiting for the sound to return, for something, anything to break the stillness. But there was nothing, only the thudding of my heartbeat in my chest. Was I imagining it? I wanted to believe I was. I wanted to believe it was just a figment of my mind, a manifestation of my fears. But something in me knew it wasn't. Something in me felt the presence out there. I wasn't alone. It was real. I forced myself to take a shaky breath and tried to calm my racing thoughts. I couldn't just lie there. I had to do something. I had to get up, check the door, and make sure I was safe. The uncertainty was driving me mad. I had to know what was in the hallway. Slowly, I swung my legs out of bed, my bare feet touching the cold floor. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards under my weight seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. I was hyper-aware of everything now. The distant hum of the refrigerator. In the kitchen, the soft rustling of the trees outside. Even the beating of my own heart. Everything felt amplified, like the world around me had grown more vivid and threatening. I stood, my legs unsteady, and crept toward the door, my hands shaking as I reached for the handle. The coldness of the door handle sent a jolt of fear through me, but I steeled myself and slowly opened it, just enough to peer into the hallway beyond. Nothing. The hallway was empty. No one was there. The silence was suffocating, the air thick and still, like the house was holding its breath. I couldn't see anyone, couldn't hear any more footsteps, but the feeling in the air had changed. It felt different now. The weight of the darkness pressing in on me felt heavier, like something was lingering, just out of sight, watching me from the corner of my eye. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise as I stared into the empty hallway. The air was thick with anticipation, thick with the sense that something was there, even though I couldn't see it. I wanted to slam the door shut, lock it, and crawl back into bed, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I couldn't look away. Something in me wanted to stay alert, to watch, to make sure whatever had made those footsteps was truly gone. And then, just when I thought I had imagined it all, I heard a voice, soft, almost like a whisper, but so close I could feel it brushing against my skin. "Come closer." The words were barely audible, but they were clear, unmistakable. A voice from the shadows, speaking just beyond my reach, just behind me, in the hallway. My heart slammed against my chest. I felt the coldness of the room seep into my very bones as I slowly turned around. The darkness of the hallway was impenetrable, but I could feel it. The presence. It wasn't gone. It had never left. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing, my breath coming in short, frantic gasps. The lock clicked into place with a sound that felt impossibly loud in the silence of the room. But even with the door shut and locked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting. I crawled back into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, trying to block out the cold, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. But no matter how tightly I wrapped myself in the blankets, no matter how hard I tried to convince myself I was safe, I couldn't escape the sense that the door was still open. Somewhere deep in the house, somewhere in the dark, it was still waiting. Waiting for me. The silence was suffocating. I don't know how long I stood there, pressed against the door, my breath shallow and ragged. The footsteps had stopped, but the air in the hallway felt heavier now, as if the weight of whatever had made them lingered in the space between the door and the rest of the house. My heart hammered in my chest and every instinct screamed at me to turn away, to crawl back into bed and pretend none of this was happening. But I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The hallway beyond my room was dark, darker than it should have been. Even with the faint light from the living room creeping through the cracks under the door, the shadows seemed too long, stretching out like tendrils, twisting in unnatural directions. I tried to rationalize it, tried to convince myself that it was just the play of light and shadow, that the house was old and the air thick with dust. But it didn't make sense. The shadows didn't bend like that. They shouldn't have stretched so far. Something was wrong. Something was waiting. I stood frozen, every fiber of my being screaming at me to move, to run. But the more I stood there, the more the shadows seemed to press in on me, their dark edges curling closer to the door. My pulse raced, the beating in my ears growing louder, drowning out everything else. I wanted to yell, to call out, to make sure someone else was awake, but my voice wouldn't come. It was like I had no control over it. And then I saw it, a figure, at the far end of the hallway. At first it was just a shadow, something darker than the darkness around it. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw more details. Too many details. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, like it didn't belong in the room. It stood motionless, just past the edge of the light, watching me. It didn't move, didn't shift, but I could feel its presence pressing down on me. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I wanted to look away. I needed to look away, but I couldn't. My eyes were locked on it, my gaze fixed on the figure in the hallway. Its outline was vague, shrouded in darkness, but I could feel it. It was there. I could almost hear its breath, slow and deliberate, filling the silence between us. For a moment I thought I was imagining it, that it was some trick of my mind, an after effect of the fear and the sleeplessness. But no, this wasn't my imagination. It wasn't just in my head. The figure was real. It was standing there, staring at me. I backed away from the door slowly, my feet stumbling over each other as I tried to make my legs obey. The room seemed to grow smaller, the walls closing in on me as I retreated. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. I could feel the presence of it, even as I backed away. It wasn't just a figure, it was a weight, a heaviness in the air that made it difficult to breathe. The longer I looked, the more it felt like the space around me was shrinking, collapsing inward, as though the figure at the end of the hallway had the power to bend reality itself. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, to flee, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The hallway, impossibly long, seemed to stretch even further. The shadows were so thick now they seemed to move, to creep along the walls. My fingers were numb against the door, and I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs, louder and louder, the rhythm of it filling the room. I tried to swallow, but my throat was dry, constricted. It was like my body was betraying me, refusing to act. My muscles refused to move. My limbs stiffened in place. It was as though I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by the weight of the figure at the end of the hallway. And then it moved, just a slight shift, a step forward. It was subtle, like a shift in the air, but it was enough to break the spell. The figure had taken a step toward me. My heart skipped, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. The feeling of being watched intensified, like it was pressing into my very bones. I was no longer in control of my own body. I knew I had to do something. I had to move. I couldn't stay here, frozen, staring at it. But my feet wouldn't respond. My legs wouldn't obey. The darkness seemed to press harder against me, like it was closing in, and I couldn't escape it. Another step. The figure was closer now, its presence so much stronger. The air in the room was so cold that I could see my breath in front of me, visible against the stillness. The hallway beyond the door seemed to be growing darker, thicker, like the shadows themselves were consuming the space, inch by inch. I tried to take a deep breath, but the air felt too thick, too heavy to draw in. I could still see the figure clearly, even in the darkness. It was tall, too tall, its form so thin it looked almost unnatural. It had no distinct features, no face, just an outline, a shadow that seemed to suck in the light around it. But there was something in its posture, something about the way it stood, still and deliberate, that filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I wanted to scream, to call out for help, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, like it was closing in on itself, suffocating me. I could feel my pulse in my neck, in my temples, the blood rushing to my head, drowning out everything else. Then, without warning, the figure spoke. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't anything that could be described in words. It was more like a presence, a feeling, an overwhelming force that filled my chest, my mind, my very being. The voice came from everywhere, from within, without, all around me. It wasn't speaking to me, not directly. It was through me. Come closer. The words weren't words at all. They were a command, a compulsion. My breath hitched in my throat, and for the briefest moment, I felt my body move. Just a twitch, just a shift toward the door, as if my body was being pulled toward the figure. A part of me wanted to scream, to resist, to run, but my legs wouldn't listen. The more I tried to fight it, the more the compulsion grew, like something was forcing me to take a step closer, to cross the threshold into the hallway. I stumbled backward, finally breaking free of whatever hold it had on me. My heart was pounding so loudly now that I could barely hear anything else. I didn't know what was worse, the fact that the figure was still there, still watching, or the fact that I was being pulled toward it. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of that house. The fear was suffocating. The darkness was too thick. The shadows were everywhere, pressing in on me, suffocating me with their presence. But when I looked back at the door, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure was no longer at the end of the hallway. It was standing in the doorway, right in front of me. I didn't remember moving. I didn't remember crossing the room. But now it was here, just inches away from me, standing in the doorway, blocking my only escape. I could feel its presence, suffocating and cold, like a heavy blanket of darkness pressing against my chest. The shadows were thick around it, consuming the room, consuming the light. And I realized with a gut-wrenching clarity that I had nowhere to go. It was waiting, watching, and now it was too close to escape. I was trapped. It started subtly, like the whisper of a breeze you barely notice at first. I had thought nothing of it, just an odd feeling that I couldn't shake, an uneasy sensation that settled deep in my chest, like something was waiting for me just out of sight. At first it was just the figure in my dreams that lingered, creeping into the corners of my waking thoughts. But soon enough it was no longer confined to the realm of sleep. It followed me, a coldness, an unnatural chill that seemed to sink into my very bones. It wasn't just a drop in temperature. No, it felt alive. It felt like something that had its own intent, its own purpose. It was watching me, waiting for the right moment to get closer. I noticed it first in the early mornings. I'd wake up, stretch, yawn, and make my way to the kitchen, the usual routine, but something was always off. The air felt heavier, like I was walking through a thick fog that pressed against my skin. The house was silent, as it always was, but the silence felt different now. The quiet had a weight to it, like it was holding its breath, like something unseen was listening. The first time I noticed the coldness properly, I was in the bathroom, brushing my teeth. I hadn't even realized that the air had gotten cooler until I noticed how my breath had begun to fog up the mirror in front of me. It didn't make sense. There was no draft, no windows open. The heater had been running just a few hours ago, pumping out heat to keep the house warm, yet the bathroom had turned colder than it had any right to be. I rubbed at the fogged-up mirror trying to clear it away, but it only grew thicker, denser, like the cold was breathing with me, mimicking my every exhale. I pulled my sweater tighter around myself, trying to dismiss the unease bubbling up inside me. It was probably just a draft, I reasoned. Old house, bad insulation, nothing to worry about. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong, something unnatural. As the days passed, the coldness seemed to grow, its presence, more noticeable, more invasive. It followed me from room to room, creeping up behind me when I wasn't looking, settling in the space just before I walked into a room. At night, it was the worst. The chill would wrap around me as I tried to sleep, as if the blankets themselves weren't thick enough to ward it off. I could feel it in the air, a weight pressing down on me, settling in the corners of my room, as though it were waiting for something. My breath would come out in short, visible puffs of mist, even as I burrowed deeper into the covers. I would wake up shivering, even though the temperature in the house hadn't changed, even though the heater hummed softly in the background. It didn't make sense. One night, I woke up to something that sent a wave of terror through me. I was lying in bed, tangled in my sheets, drifting between sleep and wakefulness, when I felt it. Cold air brushing against my face. It was the kind of cold you feel when you open a freezer door, when the icy air surrounds you like it's trying to get in. But the heater was running. The room should have been warm, but it wasn't. It wasn't just cool. It was frigid, like the temperature had dropped several degrees in seconds. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The room felt like a morgue. A sense of dread washed over me, a familiar but unwelcome feeling that had become all too common in recent days. I looked around, trying to shake the fog of sleep from my mind, but the shadows in the corners of the room felt darker than they should have been. The air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't explain, like the darkness itself was pressing in on me, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, my feet touching the cold floor. My breath came out in visible plumes, swirling in front of me as though the room had turned into a frozen wasteland. The cold wasn't natural. It wasn't a draft. It was alive. I stood up, shivering, and walked toward the door to check the thermostat. It was set to a comfortable 72 degrees, exactly where I had left it. The heat was running, the vents humming softly, but the air felt colder than it had any right to be. I reached for the door handle, but my hand faltered as I touched it. It was ice cold. Not the temperature of the room, but colder, like something had been pressing against it, holding it in an unnatural freeze. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, half expecting the cold to follow me. But there was something more pressing in my mind now, the overwhelming feeling of being watched. I could feel it, in the way the air seemed to hum with tension. I wasn't alone. Not really. Not anymore. I took a deep breath, my eyes scanning the hallway. The lights flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows against the walls. The house was silent, save for the soft whir of the ceiling fan and the distant hum of the refrigerator. But something was off. Something felt wrong. It was like the whole house was, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I walked to the living room trying to convince myself it was just the house settling. It was old after all. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I moved, but I didn't feel better. I felt exposed, vulnerable. like I had stepped into a space that no longer belonged to me. The cold followed me, seeping into my skin, into my bones, making me shiver with each step. The kitchen was just ahead, and I moved toward it, desperate for some normalcy, something that would remind me that everything was fine. But as I passed the hallway mirror, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection. A figure. It was just a shadow, something that seemed to flicker in the corner of my eye. But the moment I looked at it, it vanished. The reflection in the mirror was exactly as it should be. Empty, but I could still feel it, that presence, lurking just beyond my line of sight. The coldness grew stronger, wrapping itself tighter around me. It was like the figure, whatever it was always there, always just out of reach, just behind me. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. I was exhausted. The stress from work, the lack of sleep, the constant anxiety. It was all getting to me. I had to be imagining things. The house was old, and sometimes old houses made weird noises. But this wasn't normal. I felt it in my skin, in the way my breath came out in clouds, in the way the temperature kept dropping, despite the heat. I turned away from the mirror and walked into the kitchen, trying to focus on something simple. I pulled open the refrigerator door and stood there, staring at the contents inside. The light from the fridge cast a soft glow on the surrounding walls, and for a moment, I felt like everything might be okay. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It clung to me like the cold air, following me into the kitchen, waiting for me to acknowledge it again. I grabbed a bottle of water and unscrewed the cap, drinking it down quickly. But the coldness in the room persisted, growing colder with each passing second. I didn't understand it. Why was it so cold? Why couldn't I shake the feeling that something was wrong? Then just as I was about to close the fridge, I heard something. Soft at first, faint, but unmistakable. A low scratching, coming from the hallway. I froze, my heart skipping in my chest. The sound grew louder, more deliberate, like someone was dragging something across the floor. It was slow, methodical, like it was searching for something I couldn't see. The temperature in the kitchen dropped even further. My breath became visible again, swirling in front of me like smoke. I stepped back, panic flooding my chest, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away from the hallway. The scratching continued, getting closer to the kitchen now. It was almost as if whatever was making the noise was coming for me, and that's when I realized the worst. I hadn't been imagining the cold. It wasn't the house. It was the thing that was following me. It was getting closer. I spun around, my heart racing, and looked at the kitchen doorway, waiting, listening for any sign of movement. But the house was still. The noise stopped. The cold remained. The shadows stretched impossibly long. And as I turned back to the mirror in the kitchen, I saw it. Just a flicker of a figure in the reflection. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. I wasn't alone. And whatever it was, whatever had been following me, had crossed the line. It was in my house. And I didn't know how to make it leave. The dreams had changed. They weren't like the dreams I used to have. Strange, surreal, but somehow still separate. No, now they were different, more vivid, more real. At first, I thought it was just the culmination of everything that had been happening to me. How the figure in my nightmares seemed to grow closer with each passing night. But now it wasn't confined to the dream world anymore. It was bleeding into my waking life. It started with the street, that same empty street where I'd walked so many times before in the dreams. It was always the same. The cracked pavement, the barren trees, the eerie silence that hung thick in the air. Each time I'd find myself at the far end of the road, and there, standing in the distance, would be the figure. It never moved, it never spoke. It just stood there, watching. And every time, no matter how much, I wanted to run, my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't stop walking toward it. But that night, everything was different. I could feel it the moment I fell asleep. I was still in the same place, the same dream, but something was wrong. The air around me felt heavier than usual, pressing down on my chest like a thick blanket. My heart pounded louder with every step, but I couldn't stop moving, couldn't stop walking down that road toward the figure. I reached the usual point where I'd stop, right before I could see its face, right before I could make out the details, and then without warning, something changed. It was too quiet. The air had gone still, and the figure, it wasn't standing still anymore. It was moving. Slowly, methodically, it began to turn toward me. My body stiffened and my feet froze in place. There was a feeling in the pit of my stomach, a dark, twisting knot that told me to turn around, to run. But I couldn't. I was drawn to it, as though some invisible force had me in its grip. The figure's face was still hidden in the shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold, empty eyes that bored into my soul. I took a shaky step back, but it was too late. I heard it, a faint rustling behind me, like footsteps. The sound was so real, so sharp, that it felt like it was coming from the real world. I whipped around, my heart racing, but there was nothing behind me, only the endless stretch of the empty street. The figure was still standing there, its head tilted slightly as if it were studying me, waiting for me to make the next move. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I backed away, but my feet still wouldn't let me run. The figure didn't take another step toward me, but somehow it felt closer. The distance between us had shrunk, the air between us too tight, too thick. I couldn't escape it, couldn't escape the pull of those invisible strings that seemed to tether me to the spot. That's when it happened. I was no longer standing on the street. I was in my bedroom. The shock of it hit me like a punch to the gut. 1 second I had been staring at the figure at the end of that cursed road, and the next I was back in the comfort of my room. The same bed, the same walls, everything just as it should have been. I could still feel my pulse racing, the adrenaline of the dream still surging through my veins. But I couldn't breathe. Something was wrong. Something wasn't right. I turned to the side of the bed, and there it was. Like a figure. Not in the dream anymore. It was standing in the doorway of my room, a dark, shapeless mass. It was watching me, but it didn't move. It was silent. Too silent. The weight of its presence was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. My chest tightened, and I gasped for air, but it felt like the room was closing in around me. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The silence between us was deafening. I could hear the faint sound of my own heartbeat, loud in my ears, but nothing else. The figure was too still, its outline barely visible in the dim light from the hallway. It was standing there, just at the edge of the doorframe, waiting. I could feel its gaze on me, even though I couldn't see its eyes. It felt like the darkness itself had become a part of it, consuming everything in its path. Without thinking, I stood up. My legs were weak, trembling beneath me as I moved toward the doorway, unable to take my eyes off the figure. My breath was shallow, the air growing colder as I approached, and I could feel the icy chill of its presence surrounding me. I didn't know why I was walking toward it. Part of me knew I should turn around, run, scream for help, but I couldn't. I couldn't stop. It was like I was compelled to take that step. When I reached the doorway, I raised my hand. My body was shaking, my mind screaming at me to stop, to run, to get away from it. But I didn't. I reached out toward the figure, my fingers trembling as they stretched toward it. The closer my hand got, the colder the air seemed to become, and I could feel the temperature drop even further, as if the figure itself were pulling the warmth from the room. I reached out to touch it, and my hand passed straight through. The sensation was like nothing I had ever felt. There was no resistance, no physical barrier. My fingers went straight through the figure, as though it wasn't real, as though it were made of air, of nothingness. But even though I couldn't physically touch it, I could still feel the coldness in the air around it, the coldness inside me. I stumbled back, gasping for air, my heart thundering in my chest. The room had gone silent again, the temperature still impossibly low, my breath visible in the thick air. I couldn't understand what had just happened. What was it? It wasn't just a dream anymore. It wasn't confined to the space between sleep and wakefulness. It had crossed over into my reality, and now it was standing in my room, in my life. I turned and bolted for the bed, crawling under the covers, trying to shield myself from the suffocating coldness that had wrapped around me. But no matter how tightly I curled up, how tightly I shut my eyes, the figure was still there. The feeling of its presence lingered, a heavy, oppressive weight on my chest. I could hear it in my mind. Its whispering, that low, guttural sound that seemed to echo just beyond the edges of my consciousness. But the whispers weren't clear anymore. They were distorted, mixed with static, as if it were growing louder, trying to break through into my waking mind. I stayed in bed, eyes wide open, my body shaking under the covers. I didn't dare look back at the door. I couldn't. I could still feel its cold breath, like fingers brushing against the back of my neck. The figure wasn't just in my dreams anymore. It wasn't just something I could push away. It was here, and somehow I knew deep down that it wasn't going to leave. The minutes stretched into hours, the room still so quiet, so cold. My body ached with exhaustion, but sleep wouldn't come. I couldn't sleep, not with the figure just outside my consciousness, waiting, watching. The dreams were merging with reality. The line between the two was becoming impossibly thin, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it would come for me, fully. Before it would take me, drag me back into its world, and make me a part of it forever. And as I lay there in the darkness, I heard it. Again, the whisper. Come closer. I don't know how much longer I can stay awake. I started to notice it in little ways at first. Subtle shifts in my environment, odd glances from strangers, the feeling of eyes on me when I was alone. At work, I'd glance up from my desk only to find someone staring at me. But when I'd turn to face them, they'd look away as if they'd been doing nothing more than minding their own business. At the grocery store, I'd get that same unsettling feeling, the one that crawls up your spine and settles in the pit of your stomach. I'd walk down an aisle and catch a flash of movement in the corner of my eye. A person standing too still, a person who didn't belong, and when I looked directly at them, they'd vanish into the crowd, their presence nothing more than a lingering sensation. But the worst part was when I started to feel it at home. It wasn't that I felt safe in my own space to begin with. I had known that something was wrong for a long time, but I had convinced myself that it was all in my head, that the dreams, the figure, the coldness were just my mind playing tricks, that I had been stressed and sleep deprived. But as time passed, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, and it wasn't confined to the darkness of my bedroom anymore. It was everywhere. At first, it was easy to dismiss. The faint sound of something shifting just out of my line of sight, a shadow in the hallway that wasn't quite right. I would glance up quickly, heart skipping a beat, but when I looked, there was nothing there. The house was empty. The silence was always the same, but the air felt different now. Heavy, thick, almost like it was holding its breath, waiting. I would go about my daily routine, cooking dinner, folding laundry, sitting on the couch, and at least once every hour, I'd feel it. That feeling, the sense that someone was there, just behind me, watching, waiting. It wasn't just a passing thought anymore. It was something I could feel in my skin, a presence so tangible that it made my stomach twist. But when I would look around, when I would search the rooms, there was no one. Just silence. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. But still it was there. A weight, a presence I couldn't shake. It had become a part of my life, my days punctuated by that sensation of eyes on me. And when I was alone at night, when the house was dark and still, it was worse. The feeling was so strong, so persistent, that I began to dread the quiet. I couldn't stand being in the house alone anymore. Then one afternoon, it became undeniable. I was standing in the kitchen, staring into the fridge, trying to figure out what to make for lunch. I had my back to the living room, and for a moment I let my thoughts wander. Maybe it was the lingering unease that I could never quite shake, or maybe it was the fact that the house always felt too quiet now. But in that moment, I heard something that sent my pulse racing, a soft whisper. At first I thought it was just the hum of the refrigerator or the wind outside brushing against the window. But then it came again, clearer this time, just loud enough for me to hear it, just close enough that it felt like it was in the room with me. "I'm closer than you think." The voice was soft, almost a breath, but it had a distinct tone to it. There was something wrong about it, like it was coming from somewhere deep in my mind, rather than from the outside. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, my breath catching in my throat as the words echoed in my head. The voice was familiar, in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't a person's voice. It was more like a presence speaking to me, something I could feel but not touch, something that wasn't entirely human. I could almost hear the coldness in its tone, like it had been there all along, just waiting for me to notice. I spun around, my eyes scanning the room, but there was nothing there. The living room was empty, the same as it always was. I looked out the window. Nothing. I checked behind the couch. Nothing. But I could still feel it. Feel it in the air, thick and oppressive, like the atmosphere itself was charged with something unseen. It had been following me. The figure, the presence, the thing that had haunted my dreams had crossed over into my waking life. It wasn't just in my house. It was with me. I took a shaky breath, trying to calm the rising panic, but the whisper echoed in my mind. "I'm closer than you think." I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed my best friend's number. I needed someone. I needed to hear another voice to ground myself, but the phone rang and rang, unanswered. Of course, everyone was at work, busy, living their lives, and here I was, trapped in my own home with something watching me. I hung up, my mind spiraling as I leaned against the counter. My thoughts were a jumble of fear and confusion. Why was this happening? Why was it following me? I had never asked for any of this. I had never invited it in, and yet it was here. It was inside me, inside my thoughts, crawling under my skin. I left the kitchen and walked into the living room, unable to stay still. I needed to move, to feel like I was doing something, anything. But my footsteps seemed so loud in the silence, like they were echoing through an empty house. I checked the windows, checked every corner of every room. Nothing, just shadows, empty spaces. But the feeling, the weight of being watched never left. I tried to distract myself, sat down on the couch, tried to watch something on TV, but I couldn't focus. The constant awareness of the presence was too much. I could feel it at the edges of my vision, in the back of my mind. I turned off the TV, unable to concentrate. It wasn't the distraction I needed. I needed to know what was happening. I needed to know what was real. The voice came again, as though answering my unspoken thoughts. "I'm closer than you think." Itawira wasn't the whisper this time. It was clearer, louder, more urgent. My heart slammed into my chest and I stood up abruptly, looking around the room in a panic. The shadows seemed to grow longer, stretch farther than they should have. I took a step back, feeling my pulse in my throat and my ears. The house was cold, so cold. The warmth of the heater had been running all day, but now it felt as if the very air had been drained of its heat. My breath formed clouds in front of me, and I could feel the cold creeping into my skin, into my bones. I wanted to run, I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The house was suffocating me, pressing in from all sides. The presence was too strong. It was here, in every corner, in every shadow. I closed my eyes for a moment, squeezing them tight, trying to block out the feeling, trying to find some space in my mind to breathe. But when I opened them, I saw something that made my stomach drop. At the far corner of the room, in the shadows by the doorway, the figure stood. It was standing just beyond the edge of the light, so still that it almost appeared to blend into the darkness itself. I could see it now, clearer than ever, its outlines sharp against the shadowed walls. I could feel its gaze, piercing, cold. It was watching me, waiting. My throat went dry. I wanted to move to get away, but my body refused to obey. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even alive. Not in any way I could understand. It was something other, something that didn't belong in my world, but somehow had found its way in. And I could feel it, getting closer. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I was trapped in the silence, in the cold, in the watchful eyes of something that had followed me, that had become a part of my world, and it wasn't leaving. Not now, not ever. I never thought much of the mirrors. They were just part of the house, something I glanced at while brushing my teeth or fixing my hair. I'd always been a practical person, never one to linger in front of reflections longer than necessary. But over time, things started changing. Subtle at first, like a soft distortion that I convinced myself was a trick of the light. At first, it was only small things. I'd catch a flicker in the reflection, something out of place that I couldn't quite put my finger on, a shadow in the background that wasn't there a second before, or my own image seeming a little off. But I'd always dismiss it quickly, telling myself that I was tired, or that the glass had a smudge. Then it started getting worse. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The mirrors seemed to shift. They didn't reflect the world the way they used to, as though they were showing me something different, something darker. The reflections in them started to feel strange. For one thing, they didn't mimic my movements perfectly. At times, I'd notice that my reflection didn't follow my gestures exactly. I'd blink, and my reflection would stay frozen for a beat too long. I'd smile, and it would hold a smile just a moment longer than I did. The unease this caused grew in me like a slow fever, but still, I couldn't bring myself to confront it head on. I tried to shake it off, tried to tell myself that these were just the quirks of an old house, that the mirrors were imperfect, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the more I ignored it, the worse it got. My reflection didn't just delay its movements anymore. It started to act independently. It would smile when I frowned. It would blink at odd intervals, as though my reflection wasn't quite in sync with me anymore. I remember the first time I saw it clearly, a small, unsettling shift that almost made my blood freeze. I was brushing my hair, staring into the bathroom mirror when my reflection suddenly smiled. I wasn't smiling. My face was still, my expression neutral, but the reflection grinned wide, its lips stretching unnaturally. I stopped mid-motion, frozen, the brush slipping from my hand. The reflection stayed grinning, but it was a smile that felt wrong, like it wasn't mine. I turned quickly, looking around the bathroom. The air felt heavier now, the silence thicker, and for a moment I thought I heard a faint laugh, a sound so soft I couldn't tell if it was real or imagined. I glanced back at the mirror. My reflection was normal again, just standing there, like it always did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stepped away, from the mirror, my heart pounding. The unease lingered for days, following me wherever I went, especially when I passed a mirror. I avoided looking into the bathroom mirror as much as possible, preferring to get ready quickly, my eyes darting to the floor instead of my own reflection. But it didn't stop there. The mirrors seemed to follow me, their distortions growing more pronounced the longer I let them. I noticed them now, every time I passed, every time I looked into one. And then, one morning it happened. I woke up late, groggy and disoriented, the weight of the night still heavy in my mind. The house was unusually quiet, and I went about my usual routine in a daze. I brushed my teeth, splashed water on my face, and stared into the bathroom mirror. But this time, something was different. It wasn't the usual distortion, the usual odd smile, the frozen blink, the delayed movements. This time, when I looked up, the mirror didn't show me at all. The figure was there. At first, I didn't process it. I thought I was still waking up, still lost in the fog of sleep. But no, it was clear. The figure was standing right behind me. It was tall, taller than anyone could be, its form thin and elongated, like it was stretching against the edges of the reflection. Its face was dark, obscured by shadow. But the longer I stared at it, the more I could feel it watching me. And then it did something that made my stomach drop. It grinned. The smile spread across its face in slow motion, a wide, grotesque grin that stretched unnaturally far. It was the same smile I had seen in my own reflection a few days earlier, but now it wasn't mine. The figure's teeth were sharp, jagged, as though they didn't belong to a person at all. The edges of its smile seemed to warp, bending the air around it as though reality itself couldn't hold its form. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I blinked and the figure didn't disappear. It didn't vanish like it should have. I stared at it. My breath caught in my throat, and in that moment, I realized with a sickening clarity that it was not me. The reflection wasn't me anymore. It was the figure standing just behind me, its face twisted into that same grin, the darkness pressing in around it like it was consuming everything in its path. I tried to turn, to look around the bathroom, to confirm that it wasn't real, that I was just seeing things. But the figure remained in the mirror. My reflection, my real reflection, was still in the mirror, but it wasn't right. The figure's grin didn't waver, its eyes still dark, watching me as if it were waiting for me to acknowledge it. My pulse raced, and I felt the coldness creep into my limbs. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. I couldn't. It was like my body was frozen in place, locked into this staring contest with something that shouldn't exist. The figure behind me tilted its head slowly, unnervingly, and in that moment, I heard the whisper. It wasn't a sound in the air. It was a sensation, something deep in my chest, a voice in my mind. You're mine now. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, unable to pull myself away from the mirror, but eventually something broke in me. I turned. I turned away from the mirror, my feet unsteady beneath me, my breath ragged and shallow. I stumbled backward, my mind swirling, unable to comprehend what I had just seen. I ran out of the bathroom, down the hallway, but the feeling followed me. The coldness, the unease, the presence. It was there, everywhere, like it had seeped into the walls, into the very air I breathed. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, convinced that the figure was behind me, that it was just out of sight, waiting to show itself again. But the house was empty. Nothing was out of place. Nothing moved. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was there. Watching. The mirror had lied, and now I couldn't escape it. The reflection wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was real. It was here. And I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew it wasn't finished with me. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The image of the figure, grinning in the mirror, haunted me. It followed me into my dreams, twisting in the shadows, growing larger and larger with each passing hour. The next day I went to the mirror again. I couldn't help myself. I had to see if it was still there. I had to know. I stood in front of it, holding my breath, my heart racing. I looked into the reflection, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. My face tired and pale, staring back at me. But I couldn't let myself relax. I knew what had happened before, and the thought of the figure behind me made my skin crawl. I turned slowly, dreading what I would see, but there was nothing except my own reflection. Relief flooded me, but it didn't last. The weight of the air felt heavier now, the silence thick, suffocating. And just as I was about to walk away, I caught it, the faintest flicker in the corner of the mirror, something that wasn't quite right. I blinked, and there it was again, the figure standing just behind me. Its grin was wide, stretching unnaturally far, and I could feel its eyes on me. I knew in that moment that it wasn't done with me. It was never going to leave. The nightmares didn't stop. They only grew worse. The figure, that thing that had been haunting my dreams for so long, started to bleed into my waking life, following me through every shadow, every reflection. I couldn't escape it. It was always there, just beyond my vision, lurking in the corners, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I stopped sleeping altogether, the terror of what I might see too much to bear. But even in my waking hours, the dread never left. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt truly rested. Every night I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, my heart racing, my mind spinning in a whirlwind of fear. I'd close my eyes, hoping for a few hours of peaceful sleep, but the moment I drifted off, the figure would return. The dreams were the same each time. The street, the dark, the oppressive silence. The figure would stand at the end of the road, unmoving, watching me. I would try to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The air would grow thick, suffocating, and I'd wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air. The house felt wrong. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the leaves outside my window sent me into a panic. The shadows in my room seemed to grow longer with each passing night, stretching out toward me like fingers, clawing at the walls. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, alive and waiting. But it wasn't just the dreams anymore. It was the knock. I first heard it about a week ago, sometime around midnight. I had been lying awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind swirling with thoughts of the figure, when I heard it. A loud, sharp knock. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up in bed, straining my ears to listen. It was so real, so loud. The kind of knock that made your whole body tense, like someone was standing just outside your door, waiting for you to open it. I lay there for a few moments, too terrified to move, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The knock came again. Louder this time. Thud, thud, thud. It was coming from the door. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to get up, to check the door, to see who or what was knocking at this hour. But my body refused to obey. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the sound so loud it drowned out everything else. I tried to convince myself that it was just a neighbor, maybe someone who had accidentally knocked too loudly, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. I felt it. The weight of the air in the room had changed. The silence had thickened, become suffocating, and it was as if the very walls of the room were closing in on me. I lay there staring at the door, my eyes wide, my fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. The knock came again. I could feel the vibration of it in my chest, a low, rumbling sound that echoed through the walls. My mind raced. Who could it be? No one ever came to visit me at this hour. It wasn't the police. It wasn't a friend. It's not real, I thought. It's just a figment of your imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I could feel the presence. The same presence that had been haunting my dreams, that had followed me through every shadow, every reflection. It was in the house now. I could feel it in my bones. I had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. The knock came again, this time softer, more deliberate. And then something changed. The sound didn't come from the door anymore. It came from inside the room. Thud. A soft knock. The same hollow, unnatural sound, but it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the far corner of the room, the darkest corner, where the shadows seemed to gather and move of their own accord. I didn't breathe. My body was frozen in place, my eyes wide as I stared at that corner of the room, terrified of what I might see. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a faint scraping sound, like someone, was moving in the dark. I tried to turn my head, to look toward the corner, but I couldn't. My body refused to move, my limbs stiff, paralyzed by fear. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the door, even though I knew that wasn't where the sound was coming from anymore. It's not real. It's not real. It's just your imagination. But the voice inside my head didn't sound convincing anymore. The darkness in the corner of the room seemed to shift, like it was alive, pulling itself toward me, growing larger with each passing second. And then, just when I thought I might collapse from sheer terror, I saw it. It was there, in the corner. The figure. It wasn't like it had been in my dreams. It wasn't standing still anymore. Waiting. It was moving, slowly, silently, its shape twisting in the shadows. I could see its outline, tall and thin, its limbs impossibly long, stretching out toward me like tendrils of darkness. The air around it seemed to grow colder, the temperature dropping rapidly, as if it had sucked the warmth out of the room and replaced it with pure, unrelenting cold. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. All I could do was stare, my body trembling, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The figure didn't make a sound. It didn't move quickly, but there was a deliberate slowness to its movements that made my skin crawl. The closer it got, the colder it became. I could feel the ice-cold air wrap itself around me, seeping into my skin, freezing me from the inside out. I wanted to scream, to run, to get up and flee, but I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure, couldn't stop watching as it moved closer, its long, bony fingers stretching out toward me. I could see its face now, or at least what was left of it. The shadows clung to it like a mask, but the features were distorted, like the darkness had consumed its true form. Its eyes, cold, empty, hollow, stared directly at me, unblinking, as if it could see through me into my very soul. And then it smiled. The grin stretched wide, impossibly wide, as if its mouth was too big for its face. The smile was sharp, jagged, like a rift in the air itself, splitting the darkness wide open. It wasn't a smile of joy or even malice. It was the smile of something that had won, something that had already taken everything, and now it was just waiting for the final piece. I felt the air shift again, the weight of the room pressing in on me as I watched the figure approach. The coldness was unbearable now, the temperature in the room so low I could see my breath hanging in the air, but the figure wasn't bothered by it. It didn't feel the cold. It didn't need to. It was the cold. And then, when it was right in front of me, when its cold, empty eyes were locked onto mine, I felt a hand. No, not a hand. A touch of sensation, like a cold wind grazing the back of my neck, brushing against my skin. My body screamed for me to move, to escape, but I was frozen. I couldn't even blink. I couldn't look away. I could feel its presence all around me, filling the space, pressing in, suffocating me. It leaned in closer. Its grin widened, if that was even possible, and then it whispered, "I'm closer than you think." The voice was cold, too cold. It didn't come from its mouth. It didn't even sound like a voice at all. It was just a presence, something that pushed into my head, deeper and deeper, until I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I snapped back to reality. The figure, it wasn't real. It couldn't be. It was a hallucination. I had to be imagining it. But when I turned around, my room was empty. The shadows were the same. The cold was still there, hanging in the air like a shroud. I stumbled out of bed, my body shaking uncontrollably. I had to get out of there. I had to leave. I don't know what it was. I don't know what it wanted, but I couldn't stay there. Not anymore. I could still hear the whisper, though, deep inside my head. It was closer than I thought. The house was closing in on me. I could feel it, in the way the walls seemed to tighten around me, in the way the silence stretched into something almost suffocating. The figure had been following me, haunting my every step, lurking in the edges of my vision, making my skin crawl with its presence. I thought that if I could just leave, if I could get out of this house, maybe I'd find peace. Maybe the nightmares would stop. Maybe the coldness would dissipate. Maybe the feeling of being watched would finally leave me alone. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to escape. I had to get out of this place. The front door. It was the only way out. It had always been the one thing that connected me to the world outside, to safety, to freedom. I rushed to the front hallway, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing. The floor creaked beneath my feet, each step louder than the last as I approached the door. I didn't even hesitate. I grabbed the handle and twisted it. Nothing. I froze. The door, my door, the one that had always opened so easily, the one I had walked in and out of 1,000 times, wouldn't budge. It felt wrong, like something was holding it shut, as if the house itself was pushing back, refusing to let me leave. I pulled harder, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts, but the door wouldn't move. I yanked on it with all my strength, my arms burning with the effort, but it was as if the door had become one with the wall. It was stuck, and I couldn't understand why. My thoughts spiraled, my desperation rising like a tidal wave. I had to get out. The figure was still out there somewhere, just waiting for the right moment to claim me. I could feel its eyes on me, even now. I could feel the air shift, like the temperature had dropped another degree, and I could hear its voice in my mind, soft and insistent, echoing with a chilling certainty. Come closer. I backed away from the door, my hands trembling as I wiped sweat from my forehead. I was panicking, I knew that, but it didn't matter. The house was alive. It was aware, and it was doing everything it could to keep me trapped inside. I tried to think, tried to calm myself, but the thoughts were all over the place. If the door was stuck, maybe I could find another way out. The back door? A window? I turned toward the hallway, my mind racing, but just as I was about to take another step, I heard it. The front door, creaked. My heart stopped. It was faint at first, like a groan from the house itself, but it was unmistakable. The door was moving, slowly, reluctantly, as though it were being pulled open against its will, against mine. I stared at it, my breath caught in my throat, my whole body frozen. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But then it happened again. The door creaked louder this time, and I saw it. The gap between the door and the frame widening, inch by inch, until there was just enough space for something to slip through. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I could feel my chest tightening, as if the air in the room had become too thick to breathe. And then the door opened completely. I stepped back, my hands instinctively covering my face, but I couldn't look away. The doorway was wide open now, but there was nothing beyond it, nothing but darkness. Endless, impenetrable darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. The outside world was gone, replaced by a void. The night sky, the street, the safety of the neighborhood, everything I knew was gone. There was no light, no sounds of cars, no distant hum of the world beyond. Just an infinite blackness that seemed to suck the very life out of the air. The coldness was unbearable now. I could feel it wrapping itself around me, crawling into my skin like 1,000 icy fingers. I shivered, violently, my teeth chattering, and despite every instinct in me screaming to run, to get away from that thing, from that door, I was rooted to the spot. It was as if the darkness on the other side of that threshold had taken root in my mind, anchoring me to this place. The whispers came then, soft and insistent, like a low murmur that curled its way into my thoughts. It's waiting for you. The figure, the thing that had haunted me, that had been following me for so long, I could feel it, standing just beyond the threshold, just out of view. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence, a heavy weight in the air, pressing down on me. It was waiting for me to make a choice. I didn't know how long I stood there, locked in place, staring at the void in front of me. Time seemed to stretch, to bend, as if reality itself was warping around that door. I wanted to move. I wanted to escape. But the door, the darkness beyond it, was calling me. It was pulling me in, dragging me toward it, with an invisible force, a force that seemed to tug at my very soul. It wanted me to step into it, to cross the threshold. But I couldn't. Not yet. I turned around, my back to the door, my heart thundering in my chest, and I looked at the rest of the room. It was the same. The furniture, the walls, the hallway behind me. But everything felt off. The shadows were longer than they should have been. The air was too still, too thick. It was like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make my next move. The space felt warped, distorted, like it was no longer mine. I turned back to the door. The darkness still waited. It was still there, beckoning, pulling me in. I took a hesitant step toward it, my legs shaking, my mind screaming at me to stop, to run. But the door, it was wide open now, the shadows beyond it deeper than ever. I could almost hear something moving in the dark, something waiting, its presence like a tangible weight pushing against me. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I had to escape the darkness, the house, the feeling of being trapped inside. I stepped forward, one foot trembling in front of the other, and as I crossed the threshold, something changed. The air grew heavier. My heart stopped for a moment, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. The darkness beyond the door wasn't just empty space. It was alive. It was moving. I could feel it, a shift in the very fabric of reality, like the house had become a part of something much darker, something beyond my understanding. And as I stepped further, my body tense with fear, I could feel something close behind me. I couldn't look. I didn't dare to. But the moment I reached the middle of the doorway, I froze. Behind me, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. The sound echoed through the house, sharp and final. I spun around, heart racing, but the door was gone. There was nothing behind me but blackness. No door, no house. Just an endless void stretching out in all directions. I was trapped, again. Only this time, there was no way out, no way back. The coldness wrapped around me like a vice, and I felt the figure's presence moving closer, its cold breath on my neck. The door had led nowhere, and I was in its grip now, forever. The first time I noticed it, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe the exhaustion had finally gotten to me, or the fear had clouded my mind. But as the days dragged on, I began to understand the horrifying truth. No one could hear me anymore. It was as though my voice had been stolen, my screams erased by something much darker, something beyond my comprehension. I would try so desperately to call for help, to shout out to anyone who might listen, but the words never left my mouth. No sound would come, no matter how hard I strained. My lips moved, my throat burned with the effort, but there was only silence. I remember the first night it happened. I was standing in the middle of my living room, my eyes darting to every corner of the room, expecting to see the figure, the one that had haunted me for what felt like an eternity. The house was too quiet, too still. The kind of silence that presses in on you, making it hard to breathe. The walls themselves seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I felt it then, the presence. It was close. I could feel it in the way the air thickened, in the way my skin prickled with cold. The figure was near. I wanted to scream. I needed to scream, but when I opened my mouth, there was nothing. No sound. My own voice lost in the thick, oppressive silence that had become my constant companion. I could feel the panic rising, tightening in my chest, but still no sound came. My heart pounded in my ears, louder than any scream could ever be. But it wasn't enough to break the suffocating quiet. The figure's presence seemed to grow stronger, pressing in on me from all sides, its weight sinking into my bones like a poison. It could feel it, always just behind me, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I had to get out. I had to escape. I stumbled toward the door, but my legs were heavy, my movements sluggish, as if the air itself was holding me in place. The world felt distant, disconnected, like I was no longer truly in it, but just floating on the edge of some twisted dream. I reached for the doorknob, but my fingers barely touched it before I froze. The figure, it was there, in the reflection of the glass. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My body refused to obey, but my eyes betrayed me. I saw it there, standing behind me, its form shrouded in shadow. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me. Cold, unblinking, unmoving. It was waiting for something, waiting for me to do something. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout for help, for someone, anyone, to hear me. But the silence pressed down harder than ever, smothering my voice before it could even leave my mouth. I could feel my throat constrict, the pressure building, my chest tightening with the weight of it. I opened my mouth again, desperate, but nothing came. I screamed into the void of my mind, but I couldn't hear anything. No sound, no relief, only the suffocating silence. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough. It stood there, in the reflection, in the shadows, its very being seeping into the corners of the room. I could feel it, that weight, that pull, tugging at me. I knew what was coming, but I didn't know how to stop it. How could I fight it? How could I stop something I couldn't even touch? Something that seemed to live in the very air around me. It took one step forward, just one step, but it was enough to make my heart race, enough to make my skin crawl. My body screamed at me to run, to get away, but my feet stayed rooted to the floor. My breath caught in my throat, and all I could do was stand there, staring at the figure in the reflection, waiting for it to move. It was then that I realized the truth. I wasn't in control anymore. I hadn't been for a long time. I had already been trapped, locked in some twisted version of reality, a nightmare that never ended. I wasn't sure what was real anymore, what was a dream, and what was this place, this suffocating silence, this cold, empty void. I reached for the door again, but my hand faltered. The figure was closer now, just behind me. I could feel it. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that my breath fogged in front of me, visible in the air. I could feel its presence in every corner of the room, pressing down on me, its weight suffocating. The darkness seemed to thicken, like it was alive, wrapping around me like tendrils, pulling me toward it. I wanted to move, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. And then I felt it. A cold touch. It was like ice against my skin, a sensation so sharp and real that it made my whole body go rigid. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I knew it was there, standing just behind me, its presence so powerful that it felt like it had become part of the room itself. I could feel its breath, cold and shallow, brushing against the back of my neck. And I wanted to scream. I wanted to break free, but I couldn't. My mouth was sealed shut by some invisible force. The scream that bubbled up from my chest was swallowed before it even left me. I wanted to look. I wanted to see it, to know what it wanted from me, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around. I couldn't face it. I couldn't face the truth. And then it whispered, a voice, low and guttural, like it was coming from the depths of my mind, from a place I couldn't even comprehend. It wasn't a voice I could hear with my ears. It was something deeper, a sensation that crawled into my mind, into my soul. You're mine now. The words crushed me. They filled my chest, my head, suffocating every ounce of hope that had been left in me. The voice wasn't just a sound. It was something. It was a presence, an entity, a part of the darkness that had wrapped itself around me. I could feel its grip tightening, pulling me closer. I had to scream. I had to get away. But I was frozen, completely frozen. And then I felt the figure's fingers brush against my face. It wasn't just a touch. It was cold. So cold it burned. A sharp, icy burn that made me gasp for air, but no sound came. The coldness seeped into my skin, into my very being, and I could feel it. The weight of it, the heaviness of its touch. It wasn't just on my skin. It was in my blood, in my veins, in my bones. I wanted to look. I wanted to see its face, to know what it looked like. But the thought of facing it was too much. I couldn't bear it. But then it whispered again. You can't escape. The words rattled in my mind like a drumbeat, echoing through every inch of my body. I could feel the weight of them, heavy and suffocating. The fear was unbearable now. The figure was too close, too real. The air in the room seemed to vanish, replaced by that cold, thick void. My breath came out in shallow, panicked gasps. But no matter how fast my heart beat, no matter how much I screamed in my mind, there was only silence. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I couldn't breathe. And then finally it moved. Its cold fingers brushed against my cheek, gently, like it was caressing my face, and I felt the dark, suffocating weight of it settle deep into my soul. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, its shadow stretching out in every direction, until I couldn't see the walls anymore. Couldn't see the door. Couldn't see anything but that face. Its face. But when I finally gathered the strength to turn around, it was too late. The darkness had swallowed me whole. I was lost, trapped, and I knew I would never escape. Every night I lay awake, unable to sleep, my body exhausted from the constant tension, my mind too terrified to rest. The house was silent, still, but the silence felt wrong, like it was holding something back, something that lurked just beneath the surface, waiting for me to notice. The air in the room always felt too thick, as if the very atmosphere had become heavier, more suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. The darkness, once comforting, had transformed into something sinister, and each night it seemed to grow deeper, more oppressive, wrapping itself around me like a cold, unyielding shroud. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that I was just tired, that the weight on my chest was only my anxiety getting the better of me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. Something was in the room with me, something that had been there for longer than I cared to admit, something that wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It wasn't my house anymore. I wasn't alone. It started with the breathing. At first it was faint, barely perceptible, a slow, rhythmic inhale and exhale that echoed in the dark corners of the room just outside my hearing, almost like a memory. It felt distant, like I could almost ignore it. But each night it grew louder, more distinct. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable above the hum of the refrigerator or the distant sounds of the city. But as I lay there trying to force myself to sleep, I couldn't escape the awareness of it. The breathing wasn't mine. It wasn't the house's. It wasn't even part of the night. It was something else, something watching me. I'd lie, perfectly still, my body frozen in fear, listening to it. The sounds seemed to come from all around me, around the edges of the room, from the dark corners, creeping through the air like a slow tide, filling the space. It wasn't normal, and it was too close. Every night I thought I could feel it, a cold breath just behind me, in the dark, pressing against my skin, making me shiver even though the room was warm. I turned my head, convinced that someone, or something, was standing there, but the darkness never revealed anything. The room would remain empty, silent, save for the steady rhythm of that slow, deliberate breathing. The sound of it seemed to fill every inch of the room, curling around the edges of my bed, weaving itself into the very air I breathed. I tried to convince myself that it was just the house, that maybe it was the wind outside or the floorboards settling under the weight of the building. But no, it wasn't that. The breathing was too deliberate, too alive. One night, it grew louder. I had been lying awake for hours, my eyes wide open, staring into the dark, willing myself to sleep. But the fear kept me rooted to the bed. The breathing had become more pronounced, more persistent, and it felt like it was moving closer to me. I could hear the slow in and out rhythm of it, like someone was standing just at the edge of my bed, watching me, waiting. I could feel the pressure of it, the coldness creeping into my limbs, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. It was no longer just an echo in the room. It was real. It was here. I wanted to get up. I wanted to scream, to call out for help, but my body refused to obey. I couldn't move, couldn't even speak. My chest was tight, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my ears. I wanted to look. I wanted to see, to know what was there in the darkness, but every time I tried to turn, I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. It was as though I had become part of the shadows, frozen, unable to move, unable to do anything. The breathing came closer, so close that it almost felt like it was inside my mind, inside my head, filling the space between my thoughts. It was almost suffocating. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, the air growing colder, thicker, as though something was standing right next to me, breathing in the same space I was. I could hear it with my ears, but I could also feel it, a sensation that crawled under my skin, chilling my bones. And then, it stopped. For a moment, everything went dead quiet. The sudden absence of sound was deafening, like the room had been sucked dry of everything, leaving me in a cold, empty vacuum. My heart pounded louder in my chest, my breath catching in my throat as I waited, unsure of what would happen next. The stillness was unbearable. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was frozen in that moment, trapped in the silence. But then I heard it, a soft creak. It came from the corner of the room, from where the darkness seemed to gather, where I had always felt the presence lurking. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what it was. movement. The breathing had stopped, but something else had begun. Something was shifting in the dark, something that was moving closer to me. The silence was replaced by a slow, deliberate shuffling sound, as if someone or something was stepping across the floor, inch by inch. I closed my eyes, willing it to stop, willing it to be nothing more than a figment of my overactive mind, my own fear playing tricks on me. But no, the sound didn't stop. It came closer, each step deliberate, each movement calculated, as though the thing was aware of me, aware of my fear. I could hear it breathing again, slow and steady, right next to me in the dark. It felt like it was just inches away from me. I wanted to scream, but my mouth wouldn't open. I wanted to run, but my legs were paralyzed. And then I felt it, a cold, clammy hand. It rested on my shoulder, light at first, almost, like a warning. But the moment it touched me, a shock of ice shot through my body, and I gasped for air, the sudden coldness seizing my chest, making it impossible to breathe. The hand was impossibly cold, like it had been dipped in ice, frozen to the core. It didn't feel human. It didn't feel alive. It felt like a part of the darkness itself, something that had reached out of the void to claim me. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I could only feel the hand on my shoulder, cold and heavy, pressing down on me, forcing me into the bed, making it harder and harder to breathe. The presence that had been watching me for so long was right there, beside me, its cold fingers wrapped around me, holding me in place. I could feel its weight bearing down on me, its very being suffocating the air, pushing it out of the room. I wanted to open my eyes. I wanted to see what was behind me, what was touching me, but I couldn't. My body refused to obey. I couldn't move a single muscle. All I could do was feel the coldness, the weight, the suffocating presence that had taken over my room, my mind. I could hear the slow, rhythmic breathing again, right next to me, so close it felt like it was inside my skull. Then the hand moved. It didn't lift. It didn't retreat. It pressed into me, its fingers sinking deeper into my skin, like it was trying to mark me, to leave something behind. I could feel it now, all over my body, the ice spreading, the coldness invading every inch of me. The room was freezing now, the air thick with a palpable sense of wrongness. I don't know how long I lay there, unable to move, unable to scream, paralyzed by the thing behind me, by the hand pressing into my shoulder. I tried to call out. I tried to scream, to beg for help, but no sound came. My throat was closed tight, my lips sealed by an invisible force. The hand, the thing, was still there, and all I could do was lie there in the dark, suffocating under its touch. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the hand lifted. The breathing stopped. The room went silent. I didn't dare open my eyes. I didn't dare move. But I could feel it. It was still there. The presence, the thing that had touched me, was still watching, still waiting. It hadn't left. It never had. And I knew with a sickening certainty that it was just getting started. I hadn't meant to walk past the mirror. It wasn't like I had any intention of looking at it, or of acknowledging the thing that had been haunting me for what felt like an eternity. But as I passed the hallway, my eyes just slipped over, catching the faint reflection. It had become a habit of sorts. Avoid the mirrors, avoid the gaze, avoid the thing that lived in them. But tonight the hallway felt different. The shadows felt thicker, the air colder. And when I glanced at the mirror, when I glanced at myself, I felt the weight of something terrible settle on my chest. At first I thought I was seeing things. The reflection looked normal enough. Just me, standing there looking back at myself as I always had. But something was wrong. I could feel it, that unease creeping up my spine, tightening around my throat. The air was heavier in the hallway, thick with a presence I couldn't shake, and I couldn't help but stare into the mirror. I don't know why I kept staring. Maybe I was hoping to see something familiar, something that would reassure me that I wasn't losing my mind, that the horrors I had experienced, the figure, the whispers, the suffocating cold weren't real. But as I stared longer, the reflection shifted. At first I didn't notice it. The figure, that figure, the one that had tormented me in my dreams, was still there, standing just behind me as it always had been. It was waiting, its presence dark and oppressive, but that wasn't what caught my attention. No, it was something else. It was me. The reflection of myself, standing in the hallway with the usual blank expression, wasn't right. I took a step closer to the mirror, my breath caught in my chest, my eyes widening as I watched in horror. The reflection of myself smiled. It wasn't a smile like my usual, neutral expression. No. This smile was wide, stretching too far, like it was forced into place. Something unnatural about it. A grin that didn't belong to me. I felt my body stiffen, my knees trembling under me as I stared in disbelief. The reflection was wrong. My face was wrong. It was as though it was twisting, warping into something grotesque, something I couldn't recognize. But there it was, a grin, wide and mocking, curving upward as if my own reflection were taunting me. The figure, which had been standing behind me in the mirror all this time, didn't move. It didn't need to. It wasn't the figure anymore. It was me. I stepped back from the mirror, my mind racing, my thoughts tumbling over one another. This was impossible. The reflection couldn't do that. It couldn't be that. But as I stumbled backward, my feet tripping over themselves, I couldn't tear my eyes away from the glass. I could feel the darkness in the room, pressing in on me from every angle, making it impossible to breathe. I knew I should have looked away. I knew I shouldn't be staring at this, but I couldn't stop myself. And then it got worse. The reflection moved. It wasn't just that the smile on my face grew. No, it was worse than that. I saw my reflection raise its hand, slowly, deliberately. It was waving at me. But it wasn't me. It couldn't be. I hadn't moved. I was standing perfectly still, my heart pounding in my chest as I watched in horror, rooted to the spot. My reflection waved with a slow, deliberate motion, and the figure behind it, the one that had once only been a shadow, a presence, began to smile, its eyes glowing with malice, its mouth curling upward into something inhuman. I could feel the malice seeping through the glass, through the space between me and the reflection. It wasn't just an image, it was alive, a twisted version of myself that I couldn't control, that I couldn't stop. My body trembled, but I couldn't move. My breath caught in my throat, the air suddenly too thick, too heavy. The reflection's eyes, my eyes, stared at me with a deep, suffocating hunger, a promise of something dark and terrible. The figure's grin widened as my reflection continued to wave at me, and I realized with a sickening sense of dread that the reflection wasn't just a reflection, it was something else, something that had taken my place. I felt the grip of something cold wrap itself around my chest, suffocating me, and my heart began to pound faster, harder. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I had to get away from the mirror. I had to leave, but I couldn't. The figure, my reflection, was moving. Its hand was still raised, still waving, but now the fingers were twitching like they were reaching out, reaching toward me. I heard a faint whisper, low and guttural, just beneath the surface of my thoughts. "Come closer." The voice wasn't mine. It wasn't coming from my mouth. It was coming from the mirror, from the reflection, from that twisted version of myself that was no longer me. The figure's eyes locked onto mine, glowing with an unnatural light, and I felt the weight of its gaze pierce through me, deep into my soul. It wasn't real, I told myself. It couldn't be real. It was just a reflection. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the longer I stood there staring at it, the more I realized the terrible truth. I wasn't standing in front of a mirror. I was standing in front of a window into something else, something that shouldn't be there. The grin on my reflection's face deepened, stretching wider and wider until the smile almost seemed to split its face open. The figure, the thing, was getting closer, moving with slow, deliberate steps, its form twisting and distorting, its edges becoming more jagged, more grotesque. The hand that had been raised in the mirror lowered, but not before it reached out, just a little further, too far. I stepped back, shaking uncontrollably, my chest tight, and that was when I felt it. A cold breeze. It wasn't coming from the window. It wasn't coming from anywhere outside the house. It was coming from the mirror. The reflection in the glass rippled, the surface warping like water disturbed by a stone. I reached out instinctively, almost compelled to touch it, to confirm that it was real. But the moment my fingers grazed the glass, it froze. The figure in the mirror, my reflection, raised its hand again, this time stretching toward me, its fingers long and thin, almost inhuman, curling toward the edge of the glass. Its eyes glowed brighter, filled with something darker, something that pulsed with malice. And for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something else. A darkness moving beneath the reflection, twisting and writhing in ways that didn't belong in the real world. It was as though the glass had become a portal, entrance into something far worse. Before I could pull my hand back, the reflection's fingers touched the glass, and everything went black. I couldn't see. I couldn't move. I couldn't feel. The room seemed to close in on me, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I could still hear the breathing, the slow, rhythmic sound that had followed me for days, for weeks. But it wasn't just the house anymore. The breathing was inside me. It was filling my chest, suffocating me. I could feel it, deep, inside, as though the thing in the mirror had reached into me, had become part of me. And then I heard it again, a soft whisper just beneath the surface of my thoughts. "You're mine now." I gasped, but still there was no sound. My mouth opened, but no scream came. My heart raced, but I couldn't breathe. And all the while, the figure in the reflection smiled at me, its eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. The darkness around me deepened, and the figure, my reflection, stepped closer, closer than ever before, until it was right behind me. And that's when I realized with horrifying clarity, I had never been standing in front of a mirror. I had been standing in front of the door that led into the dark, the door that I couldn't escape. The line between my dreams and reality had blurred so completely, I wasn't sure where one ended and the other began. What had started as fragmented nightmares, where I could always wake up and shake off the terror, had grown into a constant, relentless presence. That figure, was no longer confined to the darkness of my sleep. It followed me in my waking hours, its cold breath a constant chill against my skin, its eyes always lurking just beyond the edges of my vision, never fully seen but always felt. It wasn't a feeling I could escape. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, it was always there, just behind me, just out of sight. It was like the world had become a stage, and I was its only actor, trapped in a play I couldn't leave. I'd look over my shoulder, expecting to see nothing, only to find the air around me growing colder, the shadows deeper. The figure's presence was constant. Sometimes I thought I could hear its whispering, so faint, so soft, that I couldn't tell if it was real or if it was just my mind playing tricks. But the longer this continued, the more I was convinced it was real. And then, one night it happened, the final inevitable moment when everything shattered. I had been lying awake, in bed staring into the darkness. I hadn't been able to sleep for days, weeks maybe. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt truly rested. Every time I closed my eyes, the figure would find me, its cold presence creeping into my dreams, blending with the real world until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The darkness around me was thick, suffocating. The air was too still, the silence too heavy. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, feel the sweat sticking to my skin, the heat from the blankets a false comfort. I turned my head slightly, glancing at the door, but I already knew it was there. The figure. It had been standing in the corner of my room for hours, its presence so palpable I could almost feel it breathing with me. I didn't dare look directly at it. It was always just out of view, never fully in the light, always on the edge of my sight, like it was waiting. Waiting for me to make the first move, waiting for me to acknowledge it. But I couldn't. Every time I tried to turn and face it, the fear would freeze me in place. It wasn't a fear I could fight. It was deep, primal, something that burrowed into my soul and left me paralyzed. I had spent so many nights staring at the corner, trying to convince myself that it wasn't real, that the darkness wasn't something alive, that the figure wasn't there, that I wasn't being hunted by something that had never belonged in this world. But now, as I lay in the bed, feeling the sweat dampen, my skin and the pounding in my chest reverberate through my bones, I realized with a sickening certainty that there was no escape. I was trapped in this nightmare, trapped between dreams and reality, between the waking world and the terrifying darkness that had consumed me. And then I heard it, the whisper. It wasn't a voice. It was a sensation, a feeling, a pressure in my mind. The sound of it moved through me like a wave, drowning out everything else. "You're mine now." The words felt like ice, colder than the air in the room. They sank into me, deep into my chest, a weight that pressed down on my lungs, making it impossible to breathe. It wasn't my imagination anymore. It wasn't a nightmare. This was real. It was happening. The figure was here, in my room, its presence filling the space, pressing in on me from all sides. I could feel it now, the oppressive weight of it, wrapping itself around me like a shroud, suffocating me, drawing me into the darkness. I tried to scream, tried to cry out, but nothing came. My voice was gone, lost in the same empty void that swallowed my breath. The air was too thick, too heavy, and it felt like the room was closing in on me, like the walls were pushing toward me inch by inch, forcing me into the darkness. I couldn't escape. The figure was everywhere. It had always been there, lurking, waiting. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. I could feel its gaze burning into my soul, digging deep into me, as though it were peeling me apart from the inside. The air was colder now, colder than it had ever been, and the shadows in the room stretched longer, reaching toward me, twisting into shapes that didn't belong. The room had stopped being a room. It was a place, a void, a prison. I was no longer lying in my bed. I was no longer even in my house. I was trapped somewhere else, somewhere between two worlds, two realities, unable to escape. I felt the weight of the darkness, the crushing presence of it, pressing down on me. It was like I was drowning, my chest tight, my lungs burning with each shallow breath I took. My fingers twitched, wanting to move, wanting to do something, anything, but I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped in this place, trapped with the figure, with whatever it was that had come for me. The whisper came again, louder this time, closer. It was like it was in my ear, brushing against my skin, filling my head with its cold, malicious presence. "You're mine now." I wanted to scream. I needed to scream, to fight, to run, but I couldn't. The fear was too overwhelming. My body wouldn't respond. The fear paralyzed me, locked me in place, rooted to the bed, rooted to the darkness. It was as if the room itself had become part of the nightmare, as if the walls and the floor had become one with the shadow, closing in on me, suffocating me. And then I felt it, a touch, a cold hand. No, not a hand, but something cold, wet, clammy, pressing against my face. I could feel its fingers, long, slender and freezing, brush across my cheek, dragging the chill of the darkness with them. I gasped, the coldness seeping into my skin, into my very bones, and for a split second, I thought I might die right then. The cold was so intense, so overwhelming, that it felt like it was consuming me, freezing me from the inside out. The figure was there. I could feel it. I could feel it standing just behind me, just out of my sight, but I didn't need to see it. I knew it was there. I could feel its presence, its power, and I knew that I was no longer in control. It had me. It had taken me. I was its. The darkness around me deepened, thickening like a black fog, and I realized with a sickening clarity that I was no longer in my room. I was in its world. I had crossed over. The boundary between the waking world and the nightmare had shattered, and I was now trapped in the space between them. The figure was everywhere, its presence filling the void, pushing in from all sides, swallowing the light. I was no longer alive in the way I had been before. I was part of this place now, part of the figure, part of the darkness. And then I heard the whisper again, louder this time, clearer, cutting through the thick air. "You're mine now." The last thing I felt before everything went black was the cold hand, pressing harder into my skin, as if it were claiming me, dragging me deeper into the abyss. And I knew in that final moment that I would never wake up again. The nightmare had swallowed me whole, and I was gone. I haven't woken up since. Not truly. Every night I lie down to sleep, expecting, hoping for the dream to end. But each time it comes, every single night, without fail, the same nightmare, over and over again, like a twisted loop I can't break free from. The figure still stands just behind me, always just out of sight, always waiting. But now it's not just in the dark of my sleep. It follows me too, into the daylight, into my waking hours. It's as if the nightmare has become my new reality, and no matter what I do, I can't escape it. I feel it in the air around me. I feel it in the spaces between my thoughts. Its presence is constant. Its whispers are always there, soft and insistent, curling into my mind, filling every crevice of my being. The cold breath against my skin, the cold fingers that brush against my neck when I least expect it. These things are no longer confined to my dreams. They're part of my reality now. I can feel the figure everywhere I go, in every corner of my life. It's in the shadows at the edges of my vision, always just there, waiting. I can't escape it. It has me. The days have become just as suffocating as the nights. It's like I'm moving through life in a haze, detached from everything, from everyone. I can't tell what's real anymore. The world feels like it's slipping through my fingers, like it's being erased, leaving only this thing, this presence that haunts me, that watches me with those cold eyes, that I've never truly seen but feel in every part of me. It's always watching, always waiting. Every day, every night, it's there. And it knows me. It knows everything about me. I don't remember the last time I felt truly alive, the last time I felt like I was living, really living. I'm trapped in this endless cycle, this nightmare that never ends. I try to shake it off, to break free. But the harder I try, the tighter the grip becomes. The figure is inside me now. It's not just an external force anymore. It has rooted itself deep inside my mind, deep inside my soul, until I'm not sure where I end and it begins. I tried to go on with my day-to-day life. I went to work, went through the motions, pretended to be normal. But it was like walking through a fog. Every smile, every word, every interaction felt hollow. The figure was always with me. Its presence hovered in the corners of every room I entered, in every conversation I had. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me to slip, for me to break. And when I did slip, when I finally couldn't pretend anymore, it was there. I'd catch glimpses of it at first, just out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moving where there shouldn't be one. A flicker in the mirror. But now it's bolder. It steps closer. I can feel it on my skin. Its cold fingers brush against me when I walk through the house. I hear its whispers in the silence. So soft, so faint, but so clear. "You're mine." I'm not sure when it started, but somewhere along the way, I realized that I had stopped being able to tell the difference between when I was awake and when I was dreaming. It all bled together, the waking world and the nightmare, becoming one, until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. When I closed my eyes to sleep, I was still trapped in the same place, in the same hell. The figure would be there, waiting, just as it had been when I opened my eyes in the morning. And now I can't even trust the mirror. I don't know when I first started avoiding it. Maybe it was the way my reflection never looked quite right, or the way it seemed to change when I wasn't looking. I'd turn away quickly, thinking it was a trick of the light, a figment of my tired mind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my reflection. It was the figure. I could see its presence in the mirror, creeping at the edges of my own image, like it was growing stronger, more vivid every time I looked into the glass. But tonight, I couldn't avoid it anymore. I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing my teeth, staring at my reflection like I always did, trying to pretend that everything was normal, that everything was fine. But the longer I looked at myself, the more I felt that gnawing unease, that sense that something was wrong. I could feel it in the air, the suffocating presence of it, the weight of it pressing in on me. The breathing was there again, that cold, rhythmic sound that had become a part of me, a part of my every thought, my every breath. I spat into the sink, wiped my mouth, and as I straightened up, my gaze drifted back to the mirror, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another trick of my mind. I thought maybe the exhaustion had gotten to me, that I was seeing things, that the fear had finally taken over. But then I saw it again, clear as day, and my blood ran cold. It wasn't just the figure standing behind me, as it always had been. Number this time, it was my reflection. It was me, but it wasn't me. Not anymore. The reflection I was staring at didn't move like I did. It was still, too still, like it was waiting for something. And then, it grinned. I froze. It wasn't a smile. It wasn't a friendly expression. It wasn't the small, subtle smile I had seen in the mirror before. This grin was wide, too wide, stretched so far across its face that it looked like it might tear the skin. My reflection, was twisted, wrong. The eyes that stared back at me were empty, hollow, filled with a darkness I couldn't comprehend. They weren't my eyes, they couldn't be. The figure stood behind my reflection, just like it had in the past. But this time it wasn't just a presence, it was real. I could feel its coldness seeping into my skin, its malicious presence filling the space around me, making the air heavy, thick with something sinister. I couldn't look away, I couldn't move. My breath caught in my throat as I watched in horror, as the reflection, my reflection, raised its hand. Slowly, deliberately. It waved at me. I wanted to scream, but my mouth wouldn't open. I wanted to run, to escape, but my body wouldn't respond. The figure behind my reflection, its eyes glowing with malice, grinned wider, its smile stretching impossibly far, its presence overwhelming, suffocating the space around me. The whisper came again, softer now, but with a terrible finality to it. "You're mine." And that was when I realized the truth. I had never been alive. Not in the way I thought I was. I had been trapped in this nightmare, this endless loop, this thing that had become my existence. The figure behind me, my reflection, had been waiting for me to acknowledge it, waiting for me to understand that it wasn't just in the shadows anymore. It was in me. I had become part of it. As I stared at the twisted, wrong version of myself, I felt the cold hand press against my shoulder. The same hand that had touched me in my dreams, the same coldness, that had followed me everywhere. It was real now. It was part of me. And I knew deep in my bones that I would never wake up again. The nightmare had swallowed me whole. The figure had won.